3 years after his hand let go of hers, she is on her knees in the exact place he once stood to reject her.
Bryn?
I stood there in a dress that wasn't mine, and I understood the whole room already knew what was coming, except me.
Elder, I believe the goddess made an error in this pairing.
The daughter of a border physician. Pitchable, truly. But perhaps some things are simply too plain for a title.
Perhaps your father, before he passed, understood that too, though. Some debts are never repaid in coin.
Perhaps you have always known you did not belong. No one had the courage to say it. Until now.
You are right about once known. I have always known. Only I knew it before you did.
The bowl was still warm, that was the whole truth of it. That was all Bryn Calder needed to know at 11 o'clock on the 9th night. Kneeling in the frostbitten dark of the kitchen garden, with her knees pressed into cold soil, and her breath fogging out in front of her like something trying to escape her chest before she could stop it. The moon hung low over the eastern wall, thin sharp-edged. A blade someone had forgotten to sheath. She did not look up at it. She had learned over 2 years that looking up cost time. And time was the one thing she did not have to spend on things that didn't feed anyone. The wolf was breathing, that mattered more than the moon. She set the bowl down in the dirt beside the rosemary hedge, and watched the animal's ribs rise. Rise again, slower than they had been on the 4th night, steadier than the 6th. She had learned to read those ribs the way other women read letters. Every breath was a sentence, every pause between them, a paragraph she had to hold her own breath through until the next one started. It started. A good 9 nights, she whispered, not to the wolf exactly. To the dark. To the version of herself that still, occasionally, needed to hear a fact said out loud to believe it was real. 9 nights and you haven't died on me yet. The wolf's flint-pale eyes opened halfway, watched her, did not blink. She dipped the cloth in willow water, pressed it careful along the matted fur at its jaw. And the animal, this enormous, impossible, silver-coated thing that could have opened her wrist to the bone on the 1st night and hadn't leaned its head into her palm, like something asking to be forgiven for a debt it hadn't caused. She did not know it was older than the throne she scrubbed floors for, older, in fact, than any single Castellan reign recorded in the keep's own archives, a creature that did not age the way ordinary wolves aged, that had appeared 11 times across 4 centuries to kneel before a bride no one else in the hall had thought to look at twice, and that slept in the long stretches between selections, somewhere no scholar had ever successfully mapped. Some texts claimed it rested beneath the mountain itself. Others claimed it simply walked the borders of the kingdom in ordinary wolf form, unnoticed, until the moment it was needed again. Nobody knew for certain. The warden had never been the kind of mystery that explained itself, and the priesthood that studied it had long ago made peace with the fact that some sacred things are sacred precisely because they refuse to be fully understood. What Bryn knew, kneeling in the dirt on the 9th night, was smaller and considerably more useful than any of that. She did not know that 4 floors above her, 100 candles were being lit in a hall built to hold a decision that had, in some sense, already been made the moment she chose to steal a bowl of broth instead of letting something die alone. She knew this. The wound had stopped weeping. The bandage her own torn sleeve, wrapped and rewrapped 9 times now, had held. And somewhere in the last week, without deciding to, without letting herself notice the decision happening, she had started talking to it like it might actually be listening. Which was insane. Which she knew. Which she did anyway. Because there was no one else left in her life who would. "You're better tonight," she said. "Tomorrow I'll bring you the marrow bone." Cook doesn't count the marrow. She counts everything else. Flour, salt. The candle stubs, God help me. She counts the candle stubs. But not the marrow. Nobody counts the marrow. The wolf made a sound low in its chest, not a growl. Something closer to a hum. If a hum could weigh as much as a horse. And that sound went up through her wrist, through her forearm, into her ribs and settled there, warm. Which startled her actually. Because she had not felt warm, not that kind of warm. Not the kind that sits in your chest like a coal someone left burning on purpose since before the chapel. Since before Dorian. Since before her whole life folded itself into the shape of a servant's dress. 2 sizes too big and a story everyone believed except her. She told herself it was relief. The animal was healing. Of course she felt something. Anyone would feel something watching a creature come back from the edge of dying because you refused to let it go over. She told herself that. She almost believed it. Almost 2 years is a long time to be invisible. Long enough that you stop flinching when people look through you instead of at you. Long enough that you learn the particular geometry of a great house, which corridors the nobility uses and which ones exist purely so people like you can move unseen between the rooms where the actual living happens. Long enough that grief, real grief, the kind that used to keep her up at night, with her fists pressed to her sternum like she could hold her own heart together by hand, had gone quiet. Not healed. Quiet, there's a difference. And Bryn had learned it the hard way, in the 2 years since the chapel. Because that was where it started, not the garden, not the wolf, the chapel. She had stood there in a white dress that wasn't hers, borrowed, chalk white, smelling faintly of the woman who'd worn it before her, and watched Dorian Vane, her fated match, the man the goddess herself had apparently selected for her, look at the presiding elder and say, in a voice with no more heat in it than a man returning a bruised apple to a market stall, that he refused the bond. He said the goddess had made an error. He said it plainly, politely even. As if the cruelty of it were incidental. As if he were simply correcting a clerical mistake and everyone in the room should understand that and move on with their evening. She remembered the chapel bells had still been ringing when he said it, the last of the ceremonial peal fading into the stone rafters above them, so that his voice arrived into a silence that had not quite finished being sacred yet. She remembered the exact temperature of his hand as it left hers, not cold, which would have at least given the moment the decency of drama, but simply neutral, the way a hand withdraws from a doorknob once the door has already been opened. She remembered the elder's face doing something complicated and then very quickly doing nothing at all, because an elder does not contradict a rejection spoken this plainly, however irregular the timing, however unprecedented the circumstance. And she remembered most of all, the particular quality of the silence that followed, not shocked silence, not outraged silence, but the settled, almost relieved silence of 200 people who had each, in their own private calculations, already suspected something like this might happen, and were now simply grateful it had happened to someone else's daughter and not their own. Nobody moved to comfort her, not because they were cruel, most of them. Because comfort offered publicly to a woman who had just been rejected by her fated match was its own kind of confirmation proof that something worth pitying had occurred, and pity in a court like this one traveled faster and stuck longer than almost any other currency available. She had walked out of that chapel alone, in the borrowed white dress, past 200 faces that had already, in the space of a single held breath, finished deciding what kind of woman she must secretly be to deserve this. What he did not say, what nobody said, not then, not for 2 years, was the truth. Which was that 18 months before that morning, Bryn's father, a physician who treated half the border villages for coin and the other half for nothing at all, had died owing the Vane estate a debt he could never have repaid even with 40 more years of practicing medicine. A debt Dorian's father had structured patiently the way a spider structures a web. Not to be paid, to be owned. And when the match was announced, when the goddess's ceremony bound Bryn Calder's name to Dorian Vane's in front of half the kingdom, someone in that family had done arithmetic and decided that marrying the daughter of a debtor was a worse outcome than breaking a sacred bond in public and letting the girl absorb the shame instead. 2 months after the rejection, someone reported a missing ceremonial brooch from the upper hall. A search was conducted. The brooch was found, eventually, sewn into the lining of a coat that had, until recently, hung in the servants' quarters near Bryn's narrow bed. She had never touched it. She had never seen it before the day it was pulled, glittering and accusatory, out of a coat she'd been wearing for 2 winters, because it was the only one she owned. Nobody asked who put it there, nobody needed to. A rejected Omega with a dead father's debt hanging over her name was already, in the eyes of the estate, exactly the kind of person who would steal. She was not thrown out. That would have created questions. Instead, she was quietly reassigned kitchens, laundry, the corridors where visibility died, and the theft was never spoken of again, except in the particular silence that followed her whenever she entered a room where someone remembered. She had not cried that morning in the chapel. She had not cried the morning of the search either, when they turned her coat inside out in front of the linen mistress and 3 other maids, and found the brooch glinting like something laughing at her. She had told herself at the time that she did not have the tears to spare, that grief was a luxury item like usher or good boots, and she had used up her allotment somewhere around her father's funeral and would not be issued more. She believed that for a long time. She was starting lately at the edges of her mind, in places she did not let herself look at directly, to wonder if it was true because a life reduces eventually to a schedule. That was the part no one warned her about. Not the the schedule. She rose before the sun, because the ovens needed lighting before Cook arrived, and Cook arrived before anyone with a title in this keep had opened their eyes. She hauled water in the gray hour before breakfast, 2 buckets at a time, the rope handles biting a groove into her palms that never quite healed because it never had the chance to. She scrubbed the floors of corridors she was not permitted to walk down, while carrying anything but a bucket and a brush. She learned which stones in the lower hall stayed cold even in summer, and which ones, near the kitchen flue, stayed warm enough in winter that she sometimes sat on them a moment longer than her work strictly required, just to feel something other than the ache in her knees. She learned the names of every other servant in the keep and made certain, without quite deciding to, that she was kind to all of them. Not because kindness earned her anything. It rarely did in a house like this. But because she had watched, in her father's practice, what happened to villages, where people stopped being kind to each other simply because no one above them modeled it. Her father used to say that decency was not a reward for good treatment. It was a discipline you kept regardless, the way a physician kept his hands clean whether or not the thanked it. She missed him in specific ways that ambushed her at specific hours. Not always the obvious ones. Not his funeral, not his empty chair. She missed the particular sound of his voice reading ledgers aloud to himself in the evening, correcting his own arithmetic under his breath. She missed the smell of the tincture he kept behind his ear on cold mornings. She missed being someone's daughter instead of being simply a name attached to a debt someone else had decided to collect. There was a girl in the laundry, younger than Bryn by 4 or 5 years, named Ottilie, who had arrived from a riverpack village the same season Bryn was reassigned from the upper chambers. Ottilie did not know the details of the chapel or the brooch or any of it. She only knew that the older maid with the quiet hands never once made her feel foolish for asking questions, and that on the coldest mornings, there was sometimes an extra dry cloth left folded on her shelf that no one ever claimed credit for leaving. It was Ottilie who noticed 4 nights before the 9th that Bryn had started disappearing after the evening dishes were cleared. Ottilie said nothing about it. She simply began, without being asked, covering the last of Bryn's chores on the nights Bryn slipped away, and never once asked where she went, because some kindnesses are best offered without an accounting attached. Bryn had thought no one had noticed. She had been wrong about that too. She would spend the better part of the coming year discovering how many things she had been wrong about, in ways both smaller and larger than she could have imagined, kneeling in that garden on the 9th night with a bowl of stolen broth going cold in her hands. The frost had not come yet, but the air had that brittle edge to it. The kind that cuts through thin wool and makes a person's shoulders draw in on themselves like a door slowly closing. She had torn the left sleeve of her dress 9 days ago. Had not requested a replacement, because requests drew attention, and attention in her calibrated experience drew cruelty the way a wound draws flies. So, she went about the great house one-armed in a shawl she wore pulled too tight and nobody noticed, because as established as proven as she reminded herself nightly the way one reminds oneself of a fact too painful to feel fresh anymore. Nobody had truly looked at Bryn Calder in 2 years. Except the wolf. The wolf looked at her constantly, steadily. With those flint-colored eyes that did not do the thing every other set of eyes in her life did, which was slide past like she was furniture arranged wrong. She finished the willow water compress, refolded the bandage, fed it the stolen broth a slow spoonful at a time, watching its throat work, watching the tension in its jaw, finally start to loosen with something that looked, God help her, almost like trust. You know, she said, quiet, mostly to herself, if anyone finds out I've been stealing Cook's stock for a wild animal, they're going to hang me from the smokehouse rafter and call it thrift. The wolf huffed. A sound almost like laughter if wolves laughed. If wolves did anything but bleed and heal and stare at maids with eyes like struck flint. She sat with it a long while after. One hand on its shoulder. Feeling the ribs rise, fall rise. 4 floors above her head a bronze horn was being lifted to a herald's lips. She did not know that yet, she would. The horn sounded at the 8th bell, and the great hall of Castellankeep filled the way a held breath fills a chest. All at once, and then not enough room left for anything else. 12 candidates stood along the dais in a slow curve, each one a daughter of a noble pack, each dressed in the white silk selection, hair bound in the old style that took 3 attendants and 40 minutes to achieve, and communicated, mostly, that the wearer had never in her life dressed herself. At the center, Isolde Vero, Packborn on the losing side of a long and grinding border war. Beautiful in the particular way a drawn sword is beautiful, which is to say purposeful, and a little bit cold, and entirely unavailable for casual admiration. She did not fit. She had been trained since the age of 7 to stand exactly where she was standing now, and her spine understood the assignment even when the rest of her, a part of her, she rarely acknowledged out loud, did not. 5 years ago, her father and King Ronan Castellan had sat across a council table and signed a treaty. The treaty had promised on paper an eventual end to a killing that had by then gone on far too many winters. It had also promised on the same page a marriage. Isolde had been the clause written into the parchment that made both sides able to look at each other without reaching for a blade first. Except paper peace isn't the same as real peace, and for 5 long years after that signature dried, the border still bled in small stubborn ways. Raids that were never quite large enough to call a war outright, and never quite small enough to ignore. Ronan had spent every one of those 5 years commanding the campaigns meant to finally close the wound the treaty had only promised to close. He had only just returned. The fighting had only just truly ended. A hard season's final push concluded weeks before this very ceremony, which meant the marriage clause, dormant for 5 years while the war it was supposed to prevent kept happening anyway, had finally come due. Isolde did not consider herself sold. She considered herself useful, which, in her father's house, was the highest compliment a daughter could earn. And she had spent 5 years earning it methodically, the way other people earn a trade. Tonight she intended to finish the job. To her left, Lady Ashton of Crescent Hold smoothed the same fold of silk for the 3rd time in a minute. To her right, Lady Verity of Hymir held her chin at the exact angle she had rehearsed in a mirror for 2 weeks straight. Beyond them, daughters of the river packs, daughters of the stone packs, daughters of the high pine reach, all arranged into the careful, symmetrical curve that the master of ceremonies had spent a full week choreographing with the precision of a man diffusing something. The throne sat empty on the upper step, because the king had not yet entered. He entered now. The way a closing door enters a room, without ceremony, without delay. Ronan Castellan had spent 5 years at war, and he wore those years the way some men wear a second coat. Visible. Permanent, not quite crumpled, no longer removable either. Tall enough that other tall men in the room did quiet recalculations. Broad through the shoulder where the sword belt crossed his chest. A face gone still and smooth, the way stone goes smooth under years of moving water. Not soft, worn. Along his jaw from the second siege at a place called Hollow Ridge. A thinner one across his left brow from something he had never once discussed. Not with his generals, not with his physicians, not with anyone. His eyes were the dark slate gray that ran through the Castellan bloodline like a signature. And right now, standing at the top of 3 steps looking down at 12 women who had each spent a lifetime preparing for this exact moment, those eyes were tired in a way the court could not see, and he would not permit himself to feel. He wore the ceremonial black, the heavy circlet, and inside his coat against his ribs a treaty ring rode like a small cold weight he had stopped noticing months ago, the way you stop noticing a stone in your boot after enough miles. He took the dais in 3 strides, turned, faced the hall, said nothing. Because there was, among the older families gathered in that hall, a particular kind of hush reserved for nights like this one. A hush built from 4 centuries of half-remembered ceremony, half-believed prophecy, and the specific human comfort of watching something bigger than a king decide a matter no king should be trusted to decide alone. Grandmothers had told granddaughters over generations about the last time the warden had manifested 41 years past before Ronan's own birth, choosing a bride for his father in a hall not unlike this one. In a manner the old records described only briefly, and with a curious, deliberate vagueness that scholars had puzzled over for decades without resolution. The text said only that the warden had knelt. They did not say to whom. Some in the hall tonight had come purely for the spectacle. Some had come because a daughter or a niece stood among the 12, and ambition, in a house like this, rarely announced itself as ambition. It called itself hope or duty or love and wore whichever mask suited the room it entered. And some, a smaller number, tucked toward the back where the light did not reach as brightly, had come, because they understood, better than most, exactly what was at stake if the selection failed to produce the peace it was meant to seal. He didn't have to speak. The high priestess spoke of him. The moon, the iron, the long unbroken line of Castellan blood, invoked the silver warden, the ancestral guardian that came once in a generation, chose once in a generation, and had never not in 400 years of recorded selections been wrong. The words that would call it from wherever it slept filled the hall like smoke filling a room with no windows. A long listening silence followed. Ronan's jaw flexed once. He did not believe in the Silver Warden the way the priestesses believed in it. He believed in signed treaties. He believed in standing armies and grain reserves and the careful, unglamorous management of grief. He believed Isolde would step forward, the Warden would manifest in some suitably symbolic fashion, the priestess would declare the match consecrated, and his kingdom would have its peace. And his bed would have a stranger in it. He had made his peace with that shape of his life, somewhere around the third winter of the fighting, watching a Riverpack sergeant die slowly, because no relief column could reach the pass in time. An understanding with a cold final clarity that had never fully left him, since that one wedding was cheaper than Wasefem siege. The air in the hall changed, thinned the way air thins before a mountain storm breaks through a pass, then thickened again, all at once, and there was a sound like a great hinge turning somewhere very far away and very close at the same time, and the Silver Warden manifested at the foot of the day. It was enormous. Its coat the pale silver of a winter river at dusk, its eyes the color of struck flint, and along one flank a rough strip of cloth that did not match its coat at all. Torn linen, dark-stained, carefully, patiently tied. The court did not see the cloth. Not yet. The court saw only the wolf. The priestess raised her hands, called Isolde. The Silver Warden turned its head slow, deliberate look directly at Isolde of Varro, and roared. The sound went through the great hall the way a struck bell goes through stone. Isolde did not flinch. She had been trained since 7 not to flinch at anything. But the color left her face all at once, like something being poured out of a cup too fast. The priestess hesitated. Recovered. Called Lady Ashton. The wolf roared at Lady Ashton. Roared at Lady Verity. Roared at the daughter of the Crescent Hold, the daughter of the Hymere Line, the daughter of the River Packs, the Stone Packs, the High Pine Reach. One after another, down the entire curved day, the same long bronze bell roar, until by the 8th candidate the hall had stopped breathing entirely. And Ronan Castellan, on his throne, was no longer tired. He was furious. He was though he would never in his life have chosen the word frightened, because he was watching the most carefully constructed piece of his reign come apart on a marble floor in front of 200 witnesses. And he did not yet know that 4 floors below, in a kitchen garden that smelled of rosemary and old blood, a maid in a torn-sleeved dress was kissing the top of a silver wolf's head and telling it she would see it tomorrow. The wolf turned away from the dais. The priestess's hand was still raised. No one had granted permission for the Silver Warden to turn away, because no one in 400 years of recorded ceremony had ever needed to grant the Silver Warden permission for anything. The Warden was the thing that granted permissions. That was the entire architecture of the ritual. The moment cracked open anyway, and the great silver creature simply walked off the marble step, padded down the central aisle between rows of the kingdom's most important people, and went out through the side arch into the servants' corridor, as if it had remembered an appointment somewhere and was already running slightly late. The court did not know what to do. The priestess made a noise that was meant to be a word and came out closer to a breath. Isolde turned her head slowly, by inch, and watched the wolf go. And her face, trained since 7 years old into a particular kind of stillness, did something her training had never prepared it to do. Ronan was already moving. Off the throne. Down the dais. 3 long strides that ate the distance hams especially an hour building. The captain of his guard, a broad quiet man named Torin, fell in behind him without needing to be told. And the court spilled after them like wine off a tilted table. Decorum entirely forgotten. Because the Silver Warden had just walked out of its own consecration ceremony, and nobody alive had a precedent for what came next. The servants' corridor was narrow, low-ceilinged, smelled of soap and tallow and cold stone. It was not built to hold a king and a guard captain and a priestess and a trailing knot of the realm's nobility. It was certainly not built to hold the Silver Warden, whose shoulders brushed the wall on either side as it moved, unhurried, exactly the way something moves when it already knows precisely where it's going. Bryn was coming up the back stair with an empty refuse tray balanced against her hip, a heel of bread clenched in her teeth, because both hands were full and she had learned in 2 years 40 efficient ways of carrying too much at once. She rounded the corner at the top of the stair, and walked directly into the chest of an enormous silver wolf. The tray hit the flagstones, the bread fell. She made a sound that was not quite a word, and her first thought, thumbed immediate before her brain had time to organize the situation into anything resembling logic, was, "Oh no, you're not supposed to be inside." Her second thought, slower, "You're standing. You're walking. You shouldn't be walking yet." Her third thought didn't have time to form. Because the Silver Warden, ancestral guardian of the Castellan line, arbiter of Lunas, The creature that had just roared at 12 of the most carefully bred daughters in the kingdom, lowered its enormous head and pressed its forehead gently against her collarbone, and then folded its legs and knelt at her feet, the corridor behind it filled with people. She didn't see them at first. She saw only the wolf and the strip of her own torn sleeve still tied around its flank, and the way its pale eyes closed when she put her hand on its head out of pure stunned habit. The same gesture she'd made 9 nights running, except this time there was a whole kingdom watching her do it. Then she heard the breathing. A lot of breathing. She looked up. The corridor was full. The king stood 3 paces away, looking at her the way she had not been looked at directly, with the whole weight of a face behind it in 2 years. Behind him the guard captain, the high priestess, a pressed crowd of ceremonial silk whose faces she genuinely did not know how to read, because she had spent 2 years training herself specifically not to read the faces of people upstairs. She became aware slowly of the tray on the floor. The dropped bread, her torn sleeve, the soot streak on her cheekbone for she hadn't had time to wash off. The increasingly loud, insistent fact that the Silver Warden was kneeling in front of her, and that this, by every scrap of law and custom she had overheard while scrubbing 100 pots, meant something she could not afford it to mean. "Get up," she whispered to the wolf. "Urgent. Low, please, get up, you're going to get me killed." The wolf did not get up. It pressed its head harder against her hip and made the low, contented hum she had learned over 9 nights to associate with comfort. The sound carried in the stone corridor, reached every ear behind the king, and the high priestess, who had by then recovered her voice, said, not quite triumphant, not quite afraid, somewhere balanced precisely between the two the warden has chosen. The words moved through the crowded corridor, the way a struck note moves through still water outward, in widening rings, each ring a little quieter than the last, but no less certain of what it carried. Somewhere near the back of the press a young steward who had never once in his life had reason to remember a servant's name found himself, without entirely understanding why, memorizing hers on the spot, some instinct telling him this was a fact worth keeping regardless of what came next. Elsewhere, a noblewoman who had spent the whole ceremony calculating which of the 12 candidates might best serve her family's interests, felt the entire architecture of that calculation collapse in the space of a single sentence, and found, to her own quiet surprise, that she did not mourn the collapse nearly as much as she expected to. Bryn looked at the king. The king looked at Bryn. He had not yet said anything. His jaw was doing something complicated. There was a calculation happening behind his eyes whose shape she could see clearly without being able to read its contents. And she understood with the flat, practical clarity of a woman who had been a servant for 2 years, and a physician's daughter for 22 before that, that whatever he said in the next 10 seconds was going to decide a great deal of the rest of her life. She did not look away. She didn't have the energy to. She had carried scraps to a dying animal for 9 nights running. She had skipped her own dinner twice to keep it fed. She was tired in the specific way that leaves nothing behind for fear, and so she just stood there, one hand on Zulf's skull, and looked at the Alpha King of the Castellan line and waited. He saw the soot on her cheek, saw the torn sleeve, saw the strip of that same sleeve tied around the wolf's flank, and understood without a single word from anyone exactly what had happened in his own kitchen garden over the last 9 nights. And understood more slowly, arriving at it the way a man arrives at a fact he's been actively avoiding, that the goddess had not made an error. The goddess had not made an error in 2 years he had. "Bring her up," he said. To Torin, his voice the low, controlled thing he used in war councils. The voice that did not invite questions. "Bring the wolf. Clear the hall. Send the candidates to their chambers." A pause. The selection continues. The 11 other candidates in the days that followed dispersed back to their respective houses with a range of reactions that would have surprised anyone who assumed rejection by a sacred creature must always feel like tragedy. Lady Ashton of Crescent Hold, who had smoothed her silk 3 times in a single anxious minute, wrote to her mother within the week to report that she was, on the whole, relieved beyond measure. Having spent the better part of a year dreading a marriage to a war-worn king, twice her experience in matters she had no wish to be tested on so young, Lady Verity of Hymir took the rejection considerably harder, having invested 2 years and no small amount of family pride responsibility, and required the better part of a season before she could speak of the ceremony without her jaw tightening. She would, in time, make a match of her own choosing, to a riverpack merchant's son, and would later admit to a friend that she had come to consider the warden's roar the finest piece of luck her life had ever handed her, though it took her considerably longer than most to arrive at that particular gratitude. The daughters of the Stonepacks and the High Pine Reach returned to their households largely unremarked upon, their brief moment at the center of the kingdom's attention already fading into the ordinary business of noble life continuing as it always had. History, as it turned out, had room in its records for exactly one name from that death, and it was not a name any of the 12 had expected when the horn first sounded at the 8th bell. Isolde of Vero did not go to her chamber. She went instead to the small antechamber off the great hall where attendants waited with combs and pins and the general apparatus of a woman about to be paraded for approval. She dismissed all of them with a single tilt of her chin, and then stood alone in the empty room for a long moment, one hand flat against the cold stone of the wall. She breathed. She had been raised, since she was old enough to understand the word treaty, to be the bridge between two packs that had spent a generation bleeding each other slowly. She had been taught the dances, the etiquettes, 7 distinct methods of politely disagreeing with the king. She had not been taught what to do when the goddess herself walked into a hall and said, in the voice of a struck bell, no, not her. She had expected if anything went wrong tonight that it would go wrong in some human fixable way, a nervous candidate fainting, a procedural error she could smooth over with a diplomatic smile. She had not expected to be unmade by a wolf. Her father's voice arrived in her head, the way it always did, uninvited and precise. This is a problem you will solve. A treaty is parchment. Parchment can be rewritten. You remain useful. You will find a way to remain. She breathed again. And then she let herself do something she had not planned to do, which was feel for a full count of 10 relief. It rose under the panic like a second tide. She had not wanted him. She had agreed to want him because the alternative was more cousins dying in a war that had already taken too many. But she had not wanted him, and the warden had walked off the dais and roared at her at all of them, and the part of her that had never once been permitted an opinion on her own marriage had just been handed one, unbidden, by a creature older than her own bloodline. She closed her eyes, let it land fully, then opened them again and became once more the daughter God spent 17 years building. She would salvage this, she would salvage the peace, at minimum. The wedding could be argued. The war could not be allowed to come back. She caught her own reflection briefly in the small mirror above the antechamber's wash basin before she left, a woman in white silk, hair bound in the old style, a face that had been trained since childhood to reveal nothing it did not choose to reveal. She barely recognized the calm in it. Somewhere beneath that trained stillness, a version of herself she rarely let surface was laughing, quietly, at the sheer improbable shape of the last quarter hour, 5 years of careful preparation, undone in the space of a single roar, and the strangest, most unexpected relief following in its wake, instead of the humiliation she'd braced herself to feel. She smoothed one loose strand of hair back into place, because old habits do not release their grip simply because the reason for them has changed, and left the antechamber, chin level, spine set, and went looking for the king. Meanwhile, 2 floors above the great hall in a council chamber Bryn had never once been permitted to enter, as anything other than the woman who lit the fire and left. She sat on the edge of a chair too fine for her, hands flat on her knees so they would not shake. The silver warden lay across her feet like an unreasonably large dog. The king stood at the window, had not turned in some time. The high priestess sat at the long table, a beeswax tablet in front of her, writing nothing with great care. Torrin stood at the door. No one had spoken in nearly a minute. Bryn's left foot had gone entirely numb under the weight of the wolf. She did not move it. She did not intend to move at all, on the working theory that any movement she made in this room was likely to be the wrong one. You tended it, the king said at last. Still facing the window. Yes. How long? 9 nights. Where? The kitchen garden. Behind the rosemary. Did you know what it was? She thought about the question honestly, which took a moment. She thought about the way the wolf had hummed under her palm on the 4th night, when she'd told it quietly, into its fur, because there was no one else in her life left to say any of it, to the whole story of the chapel, the coat, the brooch, all of it, and how it had simply pressed its head against her stomach, and made no sound at all. No, she said, I thought it was a wolf. It is a wolf. I thought it was a dying one. He turned then. His face in the firelight was not the face she'd seen in the corridor. That had been the working face. The face that's decisions with the back of its teeth. This was something underneath that, and she could not have named what she saw in it, only that it was not anger, and it was not pity, and her chest did not know how to file it. What is your name? Bryn. Bryn Calder. He repeated it the way a man repeats a word he intends to remember for the rest of his life. From the border villages? Yes. And before the kitchens? She didn't answer. He didn't need her to. He'd already understood. He crossed the room slowly. Did not sit, but rested one hand flat on the back of the chair across from her, and the wolf opened one eye and watched him without lifting its head from her feet. You bound it with your sleeve, it was bleeding. You fed it from your own ration. It needed broth, you told no one. I would have been punished for stealing. Something in his face moved, small, precise, like a hairline crack finally reaching the surface of something that had been under pressure a very long time. The council that convened afterward was the smallest the keep had hosted in a decade. The king Torin, the priestess, the chancellor, a careful old man named Corvin, who had signed every consequential parchment the kingdom had produced in the last 40 years. And, by her own uninvited insistence, Isolde of Vero, who had walked in without waiting for permission and been allowed to stay because the king had taken one look at her face and understood that sending her away would only start a different, smaller war. Corvin spoke first. He did not waste motion. The treaty is the larger question, he said. We solve them in that order. We solve them together, said the priestess. The warden has rendered a verdict. There is no appeal. There's always an appeal, Corvin said mildly. Appeal to necessity, to the well-being of the realm. The warden is a sacred sign. Her sacred signs have been interpreted before. It knelt, the priestess said, in front of 200 witnesses, including the daughter of Vero. It Isolde lifted one hand, and the room went quiet the way rooms go quiet for a Vero hand. My father, she said, will not go to war over a wolf. Corvin looked at her. Patient princess, he will go to war over an insult, not over a wolf. There is a difference, and the difference is the entire shape of what happens next. Set aside with respect, with a public reason that touches no honor, with a treaty rewritten to preserve trade and border accords without the marriage clause, and he will accept it. He will not be pleased, he will be on balance relieved. He did not enjoy giving away his only daughter. Isolde said nothing for a moment. Then you are offering us a way out. I am offering us both one, she said. I would prefer not to marry a man whose ancestral guardian roared at me in front of my own attendants. The king, watching her from across the table, understood for the first time, in 5 years of knowing this woman exist, that she was not the obstacle he had spent 5 years treating her as. What do you want in return, he asked. A letter reason that touches no honor. A trade accord renegotiated in terms no worse than the current draft. A pause, small, deliberate, and an introduction. To the maid? I want to meet the woman the goddess preferred to me. There was a silence. Granted, the king said all three. Corvin, who had spent 40 years in rooms exactly like this and was not easily moved, exhaled once through his nose, made a small notation on his parchment, his expression giving away nothing at all. Word of the rewritten treaty reached Isolde's father some 10 days later, carried by the crown's own courier along with the king's carefully worded letter. He read it twice, alone in his study. According to the account Isolde would later share with Bryn over tea, and said nothing at all for the better part of an hour. When he finally spoke, it was not the fury his household staff had braced for. It was, instead, a long eclex and a single sentence he repeated twice as though testing its weight. The goddess has decided my daughter is worth more than a border dispute. He had not, in Isolde's recollection, ever said anything quite that plainly kind about her before, and she had kept the letter in which he wrote it folded inside her own private correspondence ever since. Not because it changed anything between them, but because it was, she said, the first time in her life she'd had proof, in his own hand, that he'd noticed her as something other than useful. But the matter did not end there, and Corvin, patient, 40 years patient, did not intend it to. There remains, he said, once the treaty terms had been settled, the question of the woman herself. There is no question, said the priestess. There is the question of what is done with her, Corvin said, unhurried. The court will not take this gracefully, whatever the warden has decided. She is an Omega from the border villages. A previously rejected match. A kitchen servant with a, he chose the word with visible care, watching the king as he said it, a documented history. The king's jaw tightened. Say what you mean. I mean, your majesty, that 2 years ago a ceremonial brooch went missing from this very keep, and was found sewn into a coat belonging to the woman currently sitting 2 rooms from here with your ancestral guardian across her feet. I mean that there are factions in this court who will remember that before they remember anything the warden has done tonight. And I mean, he continued, folding his hand, that we must move carefully, or we will lose the peace the warden just tried to hand us. Nobody in the room noticed because nobody yet had reason to look for it, the particular stillness that came over Corvin's face as he said the word documented. The specific weight he put on history, as though the word tasted of something only he could recognize. The king said only she did not steal that brooch. I did not say she did, Corvin replied smoothly. I said the court remembers, that is all I said. And the meeting moved on, and no one thought to ask the old chancellor how he happened to know, with such precise and immediate recall, the exact details of a 2-year-old theft accusation against a servant girl he had, by every appearance, had occasion to notice. Bryn was not in the room for any of it. She sat in the small adjoining chamber with a cup of broth going cold in her hands and the warden asleep across her feet, and she could hear voices through the door but not words, and had decided deliberately, gratefully, that this was a mercy. When the door finally opened, the king came through alone. She stood too fast. The wolf rose with her. I don't want it, she said. Before he could speak, he stopped. You don't want what? Whatever's this is, whatever it's made me. She gestured, helpless at her own torn sleeve, at the wolf, at the whole architecture of a keep she had only ever cleaned. I fed it, I bound its leg. That's all I did. I don't want a position. I want to go back to the kitchens. I know, he said finally. What? I know you don't want it. I can see that you don't. That is, I suspect, a significant part of why it chose you. She didn't have an answer for that. He stepped closer. Slow. The way a person steps towards something that might startle and run. Bryn Calder, he said, and her name in his mouth was careful, deliberate, almost formal. I am not sending you back to the kitchens. I am also not putting you in a white dress tomorrow morning to recite vows you never asked for. We have time. The warden bought us that much. A pause. Will you let me give you a room with a door that locks? A meal you didn't have to steal? We will speak again in the morning. She looked at the wolf. The wolf looked at her. All right, she said. The room they gave her had a window facing east. Sheets that smelled of cedar. A fire already laid and lit before she arrived. And she stood in the middle of the carpet for almost a full minute before her body would agree to sit down on the bed. The wolf inspected the room first. Sniffed the corners, the hearth, the foot of the bed. Then lay down across the threshold with its silver back to the room. And she understood, with a small ache she hadn't expected, that she was being guarded. She slept badly. In pieces. Waking every drawer to confirm the room was real and she was still in it. Near dawn she rose and put her hand on the wolf's head. What have you done to me? The wolf opened one pale eye. Hummed. And 4 corridors away, though she had no way of knowing it, a king lay awake in his own bed, listening to the sound of a hum in his own chest that he could not explain and did not try to. In the morning a woman she did not know came to dress her. Steady hands. Her name was Nadia, and she asked no questions, which was the kindest thing anyone had done for Bryn in 2 years. Nadia dressed her in soft gray wool. Not white, not silk. Nothing that announced anything. Braided her hair in the simple border village style and said, the king said, you're to wear anything you didn't choose. Come down as yourself. If you'd rather not come down at all, a tray will be sent. Bryn looked at herself in the mirror and did not recognize the woman looking back. Hair clean, dress that fit, no soot on her cheek. I'll come down, she said. The breakfast room was small, sleeves pushed up, no circlet, and he stood when she entered, which startled her so badly she nearly stepped straight back into Nadia. He gestured at the chair across from him. The wolf went to the hearth, lay down, closed its eyes, and Bryn understood the room had been chosen specifically because the animal would be comfortable in it. Sit, please, she sat. Ate, slowly in small bites, because her body did not know how to eat a real breakfast and sit across from a king at the same time, and he let the silence stretch, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, the silence did not press on her the way silences usually did. He spoke first once she'd finished. I would like to ask you some questions, not as a king. He paused, choosing the next word with visible care. As a man who has just been told by his own ancestral guardian that he has been wrong about something for 2 years, she set down her spoon. All right, tell me about Dorian Vane. Her face went hot. Why? Because he is the reason you ended up in a kitchen garden, he said simply. And the kitchen garden is the reason the warden is alive. I would like to understand the path, she told him. Short sentences, first the ones she'd practiced for 2 years on the rare occasion anyone asked, and then, when he only kept listening, longer. And then, eventually, things she had never once said aloud. The brooch, the coat lining. The debt her father died owing, a family that had smiled at his funeral. The way shame had settled into her spine and changed the way she walked. He said when she finished, he is no longer in my service. What? Dorian left 3 winters ago to take a private commission with the Hollis house. He is not in this keep. He will be within my reach by the end of the week if you would like. I don't want him hurt. Fast certain. I don't want anything to do with him. I am not offering to hurt him. I am offering you a writ, sealed, that formally nullifies the rejection and reopens the theft record. She stared at him. Something in her chest cracked open and did not immediately know what to do with the light coming through. "I would like that read," she said finally in the same chapel. "You don't have to accept. I'm only telling you the offer exists." She did not cry. She came very close and looked down at her plate and breathed once. "Thank you. You don't need to thank me for correcting a record. I'm thanking you for offering." There was a second matter, a practical one. In the days leading up to that conversation, Bryn had noticed something else she chose not to mention right away, a pattern in the way certain guards were rotated through the corridor outside her new chambers. Always the same 3 faces, always at the hours when the rest of the household slept most soundly. She had asked Nadia about it, casually, over the mending of a torn hem, and Nadia had admitted, after a pause that told Bryn everything the words themselves did not, that the king had personally requested those particular men, and had done so the very night of the selection, before anyone had spoken a single word to her about danger at all. He had known, apparently, before Corvin ever raised the subject formally, that a creature capable of upending an entire kingdom's succession in a single roar was not a creature the wrong people would simply leave alone. He had simply chosen not to frighten her with it until he had a plan sturdy enough to offer alongside the warning. She found that she did not mind having been protected without being told. She minded, considerably more, the 2 years before it, when no one had thought to protect her at all. "Corvin believes someone may try to take the warden within 2 or 3 days, the king said. "The hide has properties. There are private libraries, old ones, patient ones, that have studied what a silver warden's coat is worth to the wrong hands. I've placed guards. Carefully. But it's your life now too. And I won't have you lied to about your own danger. It isn't my wolf, it chose you. That makes it yours in every sense the law recognizes, and most it doesn't." She looked at the sleeping animal by the hearth, the bandage, her own torn sleeve still on its flank. No one had been willing to remove it. Who would try to take it? He hesitated. "Tell me," she said. "I've spent 2 years cleaning the floors of people I've never met. I'm not unfamiliar with this court." He told her 3 names. A noble from the Hollis house whose debts outran his estates, a faction agitating for what they called bloodline purity, and a third name he clearly did not want to say, and said anyway. "Corvin, 40 years at that table, I trust him." A pause. "But Torin doesn't. And Torin is rarely wrong about people." Torin's distrust, as it happened, was not new. He had voiced it once before, years earlier, during the second winter of the border campaign, when a shipment of supplies meant for the eastern garrison had been quietly rerouted on Corvin's authority to what the paperwork described as a more urgent need elsewhere. The garrison had gone 3 weeks short on grain because of it. Nothing had ever come of the complaint Torin filed. Corvin had a dozen plausible reasons ready, each individually reasonable, and a captain's suspicion was not evidence, and a chancellor's 40 years of service was not something a court discarded over one uncomfortable winter. Torin had let it go, the way soldiers learn to let go of the things they cannot prove, and had simply privately never quite trusted the old man's paperwork again. And last night Corvin spoke about your history in a way that Ronan stopped himself. "I am perhaps being unfair to an old man. Or you're being correct about one," Bryn said quietly. He looked at her and something around his eyes loosened, the way it had on Isolde's face the night before. "You're quicker than I expected." "I've been quiet for 2 years," she said. "I have not been asleep." That afternoon word reached the kitchens the way word always reached the kitchens. Sideways. Through 3 mouths, arriving distorted and half-true. Cook heard it first from the boy who hauled water, who'd heard it from a stable hand, who'd heard it presumably from some Trotsuzi been standing in that corridor. Cook set down her ladle, looked, for a long moment, at the empty stockpot Bryn had been quietly siphoning broth from for 9 consecutive nights. Said nothing. Went back to work. But that evening when the marrow bones came off the venison, she did not throw the smallest one to the dogs the way she always had. She wrapped it in cloth, set it on the shelf by the door. Did not write a note because writing was not a thing Cook did easily, but the gesture said what a note would have said, which was, "I knew. I let you take it anyway. Don't tell me I didn't." Bryn found it there 2 days later and stood very still in the doorway of the kitchen for almost a full minute before she could make herself move again. The days after moved like a held breath. Bryn did not return to the kitchens. She did not exactly do anything else either, because no one in the keep knew quite what to give a woman who had been chosen the silver warden and had not asked to be. So she walked the upper gardens with the wolf at her side. Ate 3 meals a day she had not stolen. Sat in the small library off the breakfast room and read whatever Nadia put in front of her, slowly at first the way a person relearns a language they'd once been fluent in, and quietly stopped using, and every day the king came and sat with her for an hour. Sometimes about the realm, sometimes about nothing at all. And the warm coal in her chest, the one she had told herself on the 9th night in the garden, was only relief, grew steadis. Warmer. She stopped pretending she didn't feel it. On the 4th morning he asked her opinion on a grain dispute between 2 river villages. Not because he needed it, but because he had noticed the day before that she listened to the servants who brought the tea trays the way most nobles listen to ambassadors, closely. As if the answer mattered, she told him, plainly, that the dispute wasn't really about grain at all. It was about which village's headman had been publicly overruled the previous winter, and that the grain was simply the excuse both sides had agreed to fight about instead of the actual wound. He sent an envoy the following week to address the older grievance directly. The grain dispute resolved itself within the month, the way wounds sometimes do once someone finally treats the right injury. On the 6th morning he brought her a book of pressed botanical drawings from the Royal Archive, border village plants mostly, because he had noticed her eyes catch on the rosemary every time she passed it and had wondered aloud whether she missed the particular flora of home. She spent an hour naming plants for him that the court botanist had gotten wrong in his careful, expensive illustrations, and he laughed, actually laughed, unguarded, for what she later learned was the first time in longer than his own staff could readily recall, when she informed him that the plant his family crest depicted as a noble mountain laurel was, in fact, a fairly common and mildly poisonous weed that grew along ditches in the border villages and was mostly notable for what it did to goats. On the 9th morning, exactly 2 weeks after the wolf first knelt, neither of them mentioned the anniversary of it out loud. But she noticed he'd had cook prepare the same simple porridge the kitchen served the staff, instead of the elaborate breakfast typically set for a king. And she understood, without him explaining it, that some part of him wanted to sit across from her and eat something honest, the way 2 people who trusted each other might, rather than something performed for the benefit of a room neither of them was in. Because here is the thing about a man who has spent 5 years learning to survive a war. He does not know anymore how to simply enjoy a breakfast. He has forgotten the shape of unearned peace. So he sits across from a woman with a torn sleeve she has finally been allowed to mend, and he catches himself doing something he has not done in longer than he can accurately measure. Looking forward to something. Just that. Nothing more dramatic than that. Looking forward to a meal. Looking forward to the particular way she held her spoon, like she still expected someone to take it from her. Looking forward, God help him, to the sound of her voice saying something dry and unimpressed about a council meeting that was, ostensibly, about the most important political question of his reign. He had not looked forward to anything in 5 years. Which frightened him. Which he did not say out loud. Because kings do not say the things that frighten them out loud. Kings say things like the selection continues and bring the wolf, and we solve them in that order. They do not say, I think I am falling for a woman my chancellor considers a liability, and I do not know what to do with my own hands when she is in the room. So one morning, over the same small table he said, tell me about your father. She went still. Why? Because you've told me about Dorian, about the chapel, about the coat. A pause. You haven't told me who you were before any of that happened to you, and here because this is where the real ground begins to shift under everything that follows, she told him. Slowly. In pieces, the way a person hands over something fragile they're not sure the other person deserves yet. Her father had been a physician. Not a court physician, never wealthy enough, never political enough for that, but a border village doctor, who rode 2 tays in either direction to set bones and lance infections and deliver babies in farmhouses that didn't have proper light to work by. He had died owing the Vane estate a debt that had over the years stopped being about money and started being about ownership. Because that's what certain debts become, if you let them sit long enough, not numbers. Leverage. He never told me how bad it was, she said, not once. I found out after he died. Sorting through his papers. Finding letters I wasn't supposed to see. What did this letter say? That the Vane family had been renegotiating the terms of his debt every year, quietly. Each time worse than the last. That by the time he died he didn't owe them money anymore. She looked at her hands. He owed them me. Ronan said nothing for a long moment. That's not a debt, he said finally. That's a trap. Just act. I know that now. Her voice was flat. Careful. The voice of someone who had spent 2 years keeping this exact feeling locked somewhere she couldn't reach it by accident. I didn't know it then. I thought for a while that maybe Dorian actually wanted to marry me, that the goddess's match meant something to him too. And then the chapel, and then the chapel. Because it was not simply cruelty, what Dorian did in that chapel. It was calculation. Cold and specific. His family had done the arithmetic and determined that marrying a debtor's daughter, even a goddess-matched one, was a worse long-term liability than the shame of a public rejection. So they chose the shame. Because shame, unlike marriage, could be contained, managed, assigned entirely to her. They didn't hate me, she said, and her voice cracked slightly on the word, the first crack he had heard in these 2 weeks of careful conversations. That's the part I couldn't understand for the longest time. It would almost have been easier if they hated me. Instead, they just did math. And I was the answer that cost them the least. Ronan reached across the table, did not take her hand, simply set his own flat on the wood between them, palm up, an offer rather than a demand. You were never an answer to their math, he said. You were a person they decided was cheaper to discard than to keep. That it's not saying as being worthless. That is a statement about them. Not about you. She looked at his hand for a long moment, did not take it, not yet, but she did not pull away either, and something in the room shifted. Quiet. Almost imperceptible. The way a season shifts before anyone notices the light has changed. The priestess came to see her too that same week, though her visit carried a different weight entirely. She arrived without ceremony, sat across from Bryn in the small library, and studied her for a long moment before speaking. You want to know what it means, the priestess said. Being chosen. Most of them do eventually, once the fear settles enough to leave room for curiosity. I want to know what I'm supposed to do with it, Bryn said. There's a difference. There is, the priestess agreed, and something in her weathered face suggested she found the distinction refreshing. The old texts say very little, if it comforts you to know that. The warden has manifested 11 times in 400 years of Castellan rule. 11 times it has chosen a bride for a king. And in all 11 records, only one entry describes what happened after with any detail at all. The selection 41 years past, which chose Ronan's own mother. Bryn went still. What does it say? That she was not what the court expected either, the priestess said. That the warden knelt before her in a hallway much like the one it knelt before you in. And that the marriage which followed, by every account left behind by those who served in that court, was the happiest this could seen in living memory before it. She paused. The texts do not explain why the warden chooses as it does. I have come to believe, after 40 years in this order, that the warden does not choose based on blood, or beauty, or the careful architecture of politics that the rest of us spend our lives building around marriages like these. I believe it chooses based on something considerably simpler and considerably harder to fake. What's that? Whether a person is kind when there is nothing at all to gain from it, the priestess said. You fed a dying animal for 9 nights believing entirely that no one would ever know. That is not a quality courts are built to measure. It is apparently the only quality the warden has ever cared to measure at all. Isolde came to see her that same week, alone, no attendants, which was unusual for her, and she stood a moment in the library doorway looking at Bryn the way a scholar looks at an unfamiliar text before finally sitting down across from her. You're not what I expected, she said without preamble. I'm sorry, Bryn said automatically. Don't be. I'd expected a schemer. A clever girl who'd positioned herself near the warden on purpose. I had a number of questions prepared for that girl, a small, dry paw. I won't need them, I'm not clever. Isolde's mouth curved faint. You are. Just not the kind I was braced for. May I ask you something? Yes. When you bound the wolf's leg, did you think anyone would ever know? No. Did you do it because you thought it was watching? No. I did it because it was bleeding. Isolde studied her a long moment, then nodded once and stood. I came to tell you, she said, that I'll be at the ceremony. Front row. I'll applaud. My father has been informed and has in his own difficult way accepted. The treaty will be rewritten. There won't be a war, a beat. I suspect no one has told you that yet. I suspect you've been carrying it. Bryn's eyes filled. She did not let them spill. Thank you. You owe me nothing. I owe you a great deal. Then promise me one thing, anything. Isolde's voice dropped, quieter than Bryn had yet heard it. Be kind to him. I never would have loved him. But he's carried 5 years of war badly. And you are the first person in a long time he's looked at like a person instead of a treaty clause. Be kind to him, that's all. She left before Bryn could answer. Bryn sat a long while afterward, hand resting on the wolf's head, understanding she had just been handed a gift she would spend years trying to deserve. Not everyone at court adjusted easily. A handful of the older families, accustomed to a certain order of things, found excuses to be elsewhere whenever Bryn passed through the upper halls, and one dowager in particular made a habit of addressing her pointedly by her old title of maid long after the rest of the household had stopped. Bryn noticed. She said nothing about it to Ronan on the theory that a woman who had survived 2 years of far worse silence could survive a little more of it without needing a king to fight her battles for her. It was Nadia in the end who put a quiet stop to it, not through confrontation but through the simple devastating efficiency of gossip correctly aimed. Within a week, it was common knowledge among the household staff, and shortly after among the staff who served the dowager herself, that the woman in question had once, years earlier, been overheard mocking a kitchen maid's torn sleeve in front of the very warden that would go on, seasons later, to kneel before that same maid in front of the entire court. The dowager did not require the story explained to her twice. Her manners improved considerably, and she never again used the word maid in Bryn's hearing. Bryn found the whole episode more amusing than satisfying, and said as to Nadia over tea. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "No," Nadia agreed, entirely unrepentant. "I wanted to. There's a difference and I've earned the right to enjoy it." The recognition ceremony came a few days later. Not a wedding. Not yet. The king had been firm on that, and so had she. But a formal acknowledgement of the warden's choice and a public correction of the record that had followed her for 2 years like a shadow with teeth. It was to be small, court only. The same great hall. Nadia dressed her in pale blue. Not white, not red. Nothing that committed her to anything beyond the simple truth that the warden had knelt at her feet. The wolf walked beside her down the corridor. The priestess waited at the dais. The king stood already there, dark ceremonial coat, circlet in place, and his face when he saw her did the thing faces do when the wound they'd been bracing for finally doesn't come. She walked the aisle slowly, because the wolf was at her hip and she would not outpace it. Some of the watchings was kind. Some was not. She had grown up around courts in her father's practice, in 100 waiting rooms full of nobility, who had learned to be watched, and she could feel both kinds without needing to lift her eyes to confirm them. Halfway down the aisle, the wolf made a sound. A low, deliberate growl. Something seemed to rise a place in its chest she had never once heard before. Her hand resting on its shoulder felt the muscle bunch beneath silver fur. She looked up. The growl was aimed at the front row. Directly at Corvin, standing beside the king's empty chair, hands folded in the chancellor's habitual pose. He did not look surprised. He looked, Bryn realized. With a slow cold drop she felt land somewhere below her ribs prepared. The doors at the back of the hall slammed open, and whatever came next was not going to wait for the ceremony to finish. The doors did not creak. That was the first wrong thing. Because old doors creak. Because ceremonial doors, in particular, are built heavy and hung deliberately so that anyone entering a royal hall announces themselves whether they want to or not. Except these doors swung open silent, fast. Which meant someone had oiled those hinges recently. Which meant someone had planned this. Which meant the Sulf's growl 3 seconds earlier had not been an accident of timing. It had been a warning. 6 men came through in mercenary leather, crossbows already raised, and the bolts knocked into them did not catch the candlelight the way iron should have. Dull gray. Wrong in a way Bryn's eye registered before her mind caught up to name it. And she understood without anyone telling her, without a single word spoken, that this was the substance Corvin had warned them about days before in his careful old voice. The one that suppressed shifter healing. The one that severed bonds clean through, like a blade through green wood. The bolts were not aimed at the king. They were aimed at the wolf. Several things happened in the same breath. Torrin shouted. The king moved. The court screamed that particular high animal sound 200 trained disciplined nobles make when the veneer finally cracks all at once. And Corvin, beside the empty throne, took 2 quick steps backward toward the side door, which was the gesture of a man who already knew the timing. Which Bryn saw. Which she would remember later as the single detail that made everything after it make sense. The first bolt left the first crossbow. She did not think. There was no thinking involved. No calculation, no weighing of odds. No version of Bryn Calder that stood there deciding whether her life was worth trading for a wolf's. There was only her body, moving before her mind gave permission, stepping in front of the animal the way you step in front of anything you have already decided, somewhere below language, you cannot live without. The bolt took her in the shoulder, just above the collarbone. The impact spun her half around. She went down on one knee, hands still locked on the wolf's neck, and somewhere very far away she heard the king's voice make a sound she had never once heard a person make. The second bolt did not fire. Torrin's sword took the second crossbowman through the throat before he could pull. The third bolt went wide. Because the third man was, by then, also dead. The 4th, 5th, 6th mercenaries broke and ran for the side door. which was already closed because Isolde of Vero had crossed the dais in 3 strides and thrown the bolt across it with her own 2 hands. They hit the door, turned, weapons up, and met the king. He was not in that moment entirely a man. His eyes had gone the dark slate gray of a coming storm, his chines had lengthened. His hands ended in claws he had not used in 5 years of careful, disciplined kingship, and he went through 3 mercenaries the way a winter wind goes through dry grass. The first mercenary raised his blade and did not finish raising it. The second turned to run and discovered, in the half-second it took his body to commit to the decision, that there was no longer anywhere in that hall left to run to. The third simply stood, weapon lowered by instinct rather than intention, and understood, in the last clear thought he would ever have, that 5 years of war does not leave a man gentler on the other side of it. It leaves him efficient. The great hall built for coronations, for treaties, for the careful theater of governance and spum in 400 years, been asked to hold this particular kind of violence, and it did so the way old stone always does. Silently. Without judgment. Simply absorbing what happened within it the way it had absorbed centuries of quieter cruelties that never once left a mark anyone could point to. It was over quickly, not cleanly, and Brynn on one knee, a bolt buried in her shoulder, one hand still pressed flat against the wolf's neck, watched it happen and felt no fear at all. Because she understood with the strange calm clarity of a woman who had finally run out of room to be afraid in, that he was killing them for her, that she was going to be all right, that the wolf was going to be all right, that this violence, this fury, this man tearing through armed men with his bare hands in front of 200 witnesses, was the shape of being protected. She had forgotten what that shape looked like. The pain came later. It came after Torin carried her up the dais steps. After the priestess broke the bolt off short with her own hands so they could move her without driving the head deeper. After the king turned from the bodies on the marble floor, knuckles bloody, chest heaving, and crossed the hall to her in 3 strides and took her face in both hands and said her name once, low like a vow he'd been holding in since the corridor days before. The physician who kept the keep's health, a lean, unhurried man named Aldrich, who had served 3 border campaigns before settling into the quieter work of court medicine, had seen a great many wounds in his years and had trained himself long ago, not to let his face show what his hands already knew. He had not until that evening ever treated a wound inflicted by gray metal, though he had read of its effects in the old campaign texts and had hoped, the way physicians hope about the worst things they've only read about, never to need that particular knowledge outside of theory. The pain came when they laid her on the long table, behind the dais, and the physician arrived with his bag and took one look at what he could see through the torn fabric of her dress and went very still. "This is gray metal," he said, in the careful flat voice physicians use to keep a room from panicking. "We need it out now, before her body warms it." "Will she live?" the king said. "If we move now?" "Yes." The physician's hands were already working. "The hide won't. If they have more bolts and they reach the wolf does not survive the night. Gray metal doesn't heal. Not in shifters. Not in the warden. Then we move now." The wolf was already at the head of the table, had pushed past 2 guards without effort, laid its great silver head on the wood beside Brynn's, and its pale eyes were level with hers, and the hum in her chest despite the bolt, despite the blood, despite the cold gray weight lodged in her shoulder was steady. "Corvin," she said. "Gone," Torin said from the doorway, through the side door before the princess could close it. "Men on the gates." "He won't run for the gates," the king said quietly. "He'll run for the relic vault's south wing. He has a key, had one for 40 years. He'll go for the rest of the bolts." "How many bolts?" Brynn asked. 20. By the inventory, possibly more. "Then he comes back here," the king said. "He can't leave the warden alive. The entire operation was the hide. If the wolf survives, his people abroad don't pay. And whoever he's working with has waited too long for this to walk away from it now." The physician had the bolt out. He was packing the wound. She was aware of his hands distantly, the way you're aware of weather through a window present, but not the center of the room. The center of the room was the wolf and the king and the calculation sliding visibly behind his eyes. "Move the wolf," she said. They looked at her. "The keep out of his reach. Send it with Torin. Send it with anyone. He can't kill what he can't find." "It won't leave you," the priestess said. "It must, it can't." The priestess said gently. "The bond doesn't work that way. It chose you. It won't be made to leave while you're wounded. It would have to be carried, and a wolf that size cannot be carried by men who aren't its bonded." "Then I'll tell it to go. It doesn't take orders." The priestess's voice was very quiet. "It takes love." "I know what it takes," Brynn said. "Bring it closer." The physician had the wound packed. She turned her head on the table and the wolf turned its head toward her, and she put her uninjured hand against the side of its great silver face. Listen to, she said, mouth close to its ear. I need you to do something, and you are not going to like it, and I am going to be all right whether you do it or not, but I need you to do it anyway. The wolf's ear flicked. Its breath was warm against her wrist. Because if you don't, she said, you're going to die. And if you die, I will have spent 9 nights in a cold garden for nothing. And that's the only thing I have left from those 9 nights. Do you understand me? A pause, the hum in her chest pulling tight. Painfully tight. The way a thread pulls right before it snaps. I need you to go, she said. I need you to leave this keep. I need you to let them put you somewhere I do not know about. Because if I don't know where you are, no one can make me tell them, and I do not trust myself. Under gray metal. I would rather not know. The wolf did not move. I will not see you for some time, she said. I don't know how long you'll come back when it's safe, or you won't come back at all. And if you don't come back, I will live anyway. And I will live after. She held its gaze. Do you understand me? Look at me, do you understand? The wolf looked at her. Flint-pale eyes unblinking. Then the thread loosened. The wolf pressed its forehead against hers, very lightly, and made a sound she had not heard it make before, small. Low. Grief. She whispered. I know. Oh, it went. It rose from the head of the table and it did not look back, and Torin opened the side door, and the wolf went through it, and Torin and 4 of his most trusted men went with it. And the door closed. The priestess made a soft sound and turned her face away. The priestess had served this keep for the better part of 30 years, had anointed 2 kings and buried one, and had believed, until that very evening, that she understood the full shape of what the warden's bond required. Watching Bryn send it away with nothing but the force of her own will, she found herself questioning a great many assumptions she had built her entire vocation upon. She would spend the following weeks, in the quiet hours between her duties, rereading the old texts with a considerably more humble eye than she had brought to them before, searching for any prior account of a chosen bride commanding the warden to leave rather than clinging to it, and finding none. Bryn Calder, she began to suspect, was not simply the latest name added to an old and familiar pattern. She was writing an entirely new page into a book the priesthood had assumed for 4 centuries was already finished. The king did not turn away. He was watching Bryn. You just gave it up, he said quietly. I just kept it alive. You understand what you've done? I understand. I'm still a woman from the border villages who fed a dying animal. The warden chose me for that. If I'm not still that, the warden chose wrong. And I will not let the warden be wrong, Bryn. He said her name like it cost him something to keep it steady. I know what you're about to say. Don't, Corvin is coming. Get the men ready. He didn't say it. He took her uninjured hand instead, and held it, and the hum in her chest which had loosened when the wolf left through the door did not vanish. It simply became him. She understood, in that moment, without needing to be told, that it had been him for some time now. That the wolf had only ever been carrying her toward this. That the bond had never been with the animal at all. The days of her recovery moved slowly, the way healing always does when a body has spent its urgency on surviving and has nothing left over for patience. The physician came twice daily to check the wound, and twice daily pronounced it clean, and twice daily reminded her, in the weary tone of a man who had said the same sentence to 100 stubborn patients before her, that healing takes exactly as long as it takes, and no amount of willpower shortens it. She hated sitting still. She had spent 2 years of her life in constant, necessary motion, and stillness had always felt less like rest and more like waiting to be noticed and punished for something. Ronan found her, on the 3rd day, attempting to change her own bandage rather than wait for the physician, and simply took the cloth gently from her hands and finished the task himself, his fingers careful and unhurried against her collarbone. You don't have to prove you can survive this alone, he said quietly, not looking up from the work. You already proved that years ago. Nobody in this keep is measuring you anymore. Old habit, she admitted. I know, he said. I have a few of my own. Ask Totrin sometime about the winter I refused to let the physicians touch a fever that nearly killed me, on the theory that a king who needed tending was a king who looked weak in front of his own men. Did it work, looking strong? No, he said. It nearly worked me into an early grave. Strength, it turns out, is not the same thing as refusing help. I learned that rather late for a man my age. She let him finish the bandage. She let herself for the first time, in longer than she could measure, simply be tended to without calculating what it might cost her afterward. Nadia came by each evening during that stretch of recovery, ostensibly to help with the changing of linens or the brushing out of hair too tense at the shoulder to manage alone, but mostly, Bryn suspected, simply to sit with her a while and make certain, with her own eyes, That the woman she had dressed on that very first strange morning was still in fact, breathing. "You gave me quite a fright," Nadia admitted one evening, working a comb gently through hair that had gone tangled from days spent mostly lying still. "I don't scare easily. 20 years in this keep sees to that. But watching you go down on that day," she stopped, cleared her throat, and finished the sentence in a considerably brisker tone than she'd started it in. "Well, I'm glad you didn't die. It would have been a great deal of wasted effort on that gray dress." Bryn laughed, which pulled uncomfortably at her healing shoulder, which made her laugh harder despite the pain of it. "I'll try to stay alive out of respect for the wardrobe then." "See that you do," Nadia said, and continued the braid with the same steady, unhurried hand she'd used from the very beginning. And neither of them said anything further about fear, because some things are better carried in the ordinary rhythm of a comb through hair than in any words either of them could have found for it. They did not have long to sit with that particular ease, because a kingdom under attack does not pause for a woman to catch her breath, however much it might owe her one. She had told him about her father over breakfast 3 days after the selection. She had told him about the chapel a week before that. And in the days between all of it, the questions, the careful mornings, the quiet accumulation of trust that had built, brick by brick, into whatever this now was, Bryn had learned to notice things, small things. The kind of small thing that only becomes visible to someone who has spent 2 years watching Bohing's hands more closely than their faces, because hands, unlike faces, rarely learn to lie. She had noticed it first during a routine council meeting the week before the ceremony. Grain allocations for the eastern villages is dispute between 2 riverpack families over water rights, the kind of business that fills the actual, unglamorous hours of governing a kingdom. Corvin's hand, resting on the table, had tightened almost imperceptibly every time the subject of the grey metal bolts came up. Not fear exactly. Something closer to a man checking reflexively that a plan already in motion had not yet been discovered. She had said nothing during the meeting. She had said something afterward. "He's lying about the timeline," she told Ronan that evening, in the small chamber that had become, without either of them quite naming it as such, the place where the real conversations of the day happened. "About what specifically?" "When Corvin first briefed us about the grey metal threat, he said he'd learned of factions interested in the Warden's hide within the last several months. Since your return from the border, essentially. But today, discussing the grain allocations, he mentioned offhand, like it meant nothing, a supply requisition from 3 years ago that referenced specialized containment materials for the Southern Relic Vault." She paused. 3 years, not several months. Ronan went very still. "You're certain I've spent 2 years listening to people talk, without paying attention to who was listening back?" Bryn said. "I notice inconsistencies. It's the only skill scrubbing floors ever gave me that turned out to be useful for something other than floors." "If he's known for 3 years then, whatever he warned us about wasn't a threat he discovered," Bryn said quietly. "It was a threat he's been managing. Personally, for a very long time. They did not confront him, not yet. Because confronting a man who has spent 40 years learning to survive royal courts, without proof solid enough to hold, would only teach him to hide his tracks more carefully. Instead, Ronan set Torin quietly, without official orders that could be traced back through any paper trail. Corvin might have access to review the requisition records from the Relic Vault for the past 5 years. Nadia noticed the change in the household before anyone explained it to her, the way people who run a keep's daily rhythm always notice first. Guards posted at this hour they had never been posted before. Torin appearing in corridors he had no obvious business in. The king excusing himself from evening meals to meet privately with his captain, leaving half a plate untouched, which for a man who had spent 5 years learning to eat whatever was in front of him whenever it was in front of him, was itself a kind of confession. "Something's wrong," Nadia said to Bryn one evening, helping unpin her hair with the same brisk, unhurried hands she'd used since the very first morning. "I don't ask questions I'm not owed answers to, but I've dressed enough frightened women in my life to know the look when it walks into a room. It's not settled yet, Bryn. You'll know before most of the court does." "That's not a no," Bryn agreed. "It isn't." Nadia said nothing further. She simply finished the braid, set the pins down with more care than usual, and left the door slightly ajar on her way out, a small silent thing that meant, in the particular language 2 women had built between them over these strange weeks, "I am close if you need me and I will not make you ask." It took Torin 6 days. What he found, brought to Ronan and Bryn together in the small chamber late at night, by candlelight, changed the entire shape of what came next. 3 separate shipments, Torin said, laying parchment on the table between them. Over the last 3 years, Each one logged under Corvin's personal authorization, each one described in general terms: ceremonial materials, archival preservation supplies. Vague enough that no one questioned them because no one questions the Chancellor's paperwork. He's had 40 years to become the kind of man whose paperwork nobody questions. Grey metal, Bryn said. I believe so. I can't be certain without physical inspection of the vault contents, and he controls access to that vault personally. Torrhen's jaw tightened, which means confirming this beyond doubt requires either his cooperation unlikely or forcing the issue in a way that will alert him the moment we try. Roan was quiet a long moment, staring at the parchment as though it might rearrange itself into something devastating if he looked long enough. 40 years, he said finally. My father trusted this man with everything. I trusted him with everything. Trust isn't proof of character, Bryn said quietly. It's proof of consistency. He was consistent for a very long time. That doesn't mean he was ever honest. It only means whatever he was planning required patience most men don't have. Ronan looked at her. Something in his face, grief and recognition, and something that might have been gratitude for her refusal to soften the truth for his comfort settled there for a long moment. You keep doing that, he said. Doing what? Telling me the truth plainly. When everyone else has spent 5 years telling me only what they think I can bear to hear. I spent 2 years being told lies by people who thought I couldn't handle the truth, Bryn said. I decided a long time ago I would rather know. He thought about that a long while after she had gone to bed that night, sitting alone by the fire in the small chamber that had become, without either of them naming it, the true center of his private life. He had been raised from boyhood to believe that a king's strength lay in certainty in never once, publicly, allowing doubt to show on his face, because a hesitant king was a king armies stopped trusting and councils stopped fearing. He had built himself across 5 years of war into precisely that kind of certainty, unshakable, unreadable. The kind of man other men followed into a siege without asking questions, because questions were a luxury a war could not afford. He was only now beginning to understand that certainty and honesty were not in fact the same virtue, and that he had spent 5 years mistaking the first for a substitute for the second. Bryn did not need him to be certain. She needed him to be honest, even when honesty meant admitting a war he could not have prevented, or a trust he had misplaced for 40 years, or a fear he had never once allowed himself to name out loud until a woman with soot on her cheek looked at him plainly and made it safe to. But knowing is not the same as being ready. Because 2 days later, before they could act on what Torrhen had found, before any of the careful patient work could be turned into consequence, Corvin moved first. He always moved first. That was the entire shape of his 40 years at that table. Patience, and, when patience finally ran out, speed. It began deceptively as good news. A messenger arrived reporting a minor skirmish along the southern border, nothing serious. A handful of Hollis House mercenaries, testing the old boundary the way certain restless factions did every few months when peace made them nervous. Routine. The kind of report that crossed a king's desk a dozen times a year and required nothing more than a formal acknowledgement. Except Corvin insisted, with unusual firmness, that the king personally review the garrison's response plans. In the South Wing. That evening, alone save for the Chancellor himself, given the sensitivity of troop movements this close to the Vossreach Treaty renegotiation, Ronan almost agreed. He would have agreed 3 weeks earlier without a second thought, because that was exactly the kind of request Corvin made routinely, and exactly the kind of request a king trusted implicitly for 40 years simply granted. But Bryn was in the room when the message arrived. And something in her face, a stillness, a held breath, the specific alertness of a woman who had spent 2 years learning to read danger in the smallest shifts of tone, made Ronan pause before answering. Give me the evening to consider troop positioning myself. First, he told the messenger. I'll meet with the Chancellor tomorrow. Once I've reviewed the maps, the messenger left. Corvin, informed of the delay, expressed polite understanding. But that night, Torrhen's men stationed quietly at Ronan's private request, the South Relic Vault, reported movement. Corvin, alone, entering the vault after the household had gone to sleep. He's accelerating, Ronan said, reading Torrhen's report by candlelight, his face gone hard in a way Bryn had not yet seen. Whatever he's planning. The delay on the troop meeting told him we're getting close. He knows we're getting close. Then he'll move again, Bryn said. Soon. Move how? Bryn thought of Corvin's hand tightening on the council table at the mention of grey metal. Thought of the ceremony scheduled for 2 days later, the recognition ceremony, the one at which the entire court, and Corvin among them, would be gathered in a single hall. He needs the warden gone before the truth about him comes out, she said slowly, working it through as she spoke. Because right now the only thing standing between him and exposure is time. If the warden is destroyed, if the whole reason for this investigation disappears, then there's no proof left to chase, Ronan finished. Just an old chancellor's paperwork irregularities that could be explained away a dozen boring ways. He's not protecting a secret anymore, Bryn said. He's protecting the last chance to bury it. Which is exactly what brought the ambush to the recognition ceremony 2 days later. The doors that did not creak. The bolts that caught no candlelight. A growl rising from a wolf's chest aimed directly at a man who had spent 40 years learning exactly how to look unsurprised. The ambush had not been the beginning of Corvin's betrayal. It had been the end of his patience. He came back with 11 men. 6 keep guards he had quietly bought loyalty from across years of careful, small favors. 5 mercenaries he had been sheltering in a barn outside the south wall for exactly this contingency. And he came in through the south wing because the south wing held the vault, and the vault held the rest of the bolts. And Corvin, old, patient, and now finally out of patience, entirely believed he could still finish what he had started. He did not expect to find the king waiting for him in the corridor outside the vault. He stopped. The king looked at him a long moment, and Corvin, who had spent 40 years reading the faces of powerful men, read this once and understood, with a calm that genuinely surprised him, that he was not going to survive the next 10 minutes. 40 years, Ronan said. 40 years, Corvin agreed, mild as ever, as though they were discussing the weather rather than the end of his life. I read the old texts when I was young. I was not always old, Your Majesty. I was a scholar once, did you know that? Ronan then said nothing. I read about the hide, Corvin continued, unhurried. What it could do. What could be distilled from it. What contracts could be written against the lives of kings, if a man had patience enough to wait for generations warden to manifest. I made arrangements. They took a long time to mature. A faint, almost fond smile. I am sorry it had to be on your watch. I am fond of you, Ronan. I have always been fond of you. Why? It was the only word Ronan trusted himself to say. Corvin's expression shifted. The first genuine crack Bryn, arriving at the corridor's edge with her shoulder bound and her face pale, had ever seen in the old chancellor's composure. You want a reason, Corvin said. Everyone always wants a reason. As though evil requires an explanation to be tolerable. He was quiet a moment. My daughter stood on that dais once 20 years ago. One of 12 candidates, same as this year. Same silks, same rehearsed. His jaw tightened. The warden did not choose her. That is not the tragedy. The warden does not choose most candidates, and most candidates go home and live entirely ordinary, entirely adequate lives. What happened to her? The court happened to her, Corvin said, and for the first time in 40 years his voice had an edge in it that sounded almost like grief. The rumor started before the ceremony was even finished that she had been overlooked because of some flaw in her bloodline, some weakness the warden alone could detect. It wasn't true. It was cruelty dressed up as prophecy, the way court cruelty always dresses itself up as something more dignified than what it actually is. But rumors do not require truth to do damage. Only repetition. He looked briefly at Bryn, standing pale and silent at the corridor's edge. She took her own life 8 months later, Corvin said. 19 years old. And I stood at her grave and I understood something the rest of this court has never once had to understand, that the entire selection system, the whole sacred architecture of it, chews up young women and calls the wreckage divine will. I decided that day that if I could not save my daughter, I would at least make certain the system that killed her never had another generation to repeat itself in. By killing the warden, Ronan said quietly. By ending the ceremony forever, Corvin corrected. No warden, no selection, no more 19-year-old girls destroyed by a roar they didn't survive being unchosen by. His eyes, when they met Ronan's again, were entirely without apology. I did not do this for gold, Your Majesty. I did this so that no father ever again stands at a grave the way I stood at mine. The corridor was silent a long moment. You could have told me, Ronan said. And there was something raw in his voice now, something that had been building since the ceremony, since the corridor, since the moment he first understood the man he'd trusted with everything, had been carrying this for 2 decades in silence. You could have brought this to me. We could have changed the ceremony, reformed it. You didn't have to burn down the entire house to fix one broken window. You were a boy when it happened, Corvin said, almost gently. And then you were a boy at war for 5 years. And there was never a right moment. And then there was never going to be a right moment. And eventually patience curdles into something else entirely if you carry it long enough alone. He looked once more toward Bryn. I am sorry it was you who ended up in the path of it. You did not deserve any of this. I want you to know that at least. It's true, the fight when it came was short. Corvin's bought men were competent, but they were not keep guards in earnest, and the guards at the king's back were. Torin arrived from the postern skirmish with his sword already wet, and the 11 became 4, and then 2, and then none. Corvin, who had not drawn a weapon in 40 years, drew one now, an old short blade kept in his desk for ceremony, more symbol than tool, and raised it at the king with a hand that was at the last perfectly steady. He did not strike, he never had the chance. The bolt that took him through the throat came from his own dropped quiver, kicked across the flagstones by a guard's boot, skidding, rising on its fletching, and finding the meat of his neck on the upswing. His own weapon, his own grey metals. The substance he had spent quietly stockpiling to end a warden's line, ending instead the man who had planned it. He sat down slowly against the vault door. His eyes at the last were not afraid. They were only very faintly surprised, the particular surprise of a man who had done his arithmetic for 40 years and only now at the very end noticed an error in the second column. Ronan stood over him until he was certain. Then he turned and went back through the corridors, past the bodies, past the wreckage of a ceremony no one in that keep would ever fully stop talking about, to the small chamber behind the dais, where Bryn sat propped against a bank of cushions, her shoulder bound, color slowly returning to her face. The hum in her chest leapt when he came through the door. He crossed to her in 3 strides and went down on one knee beside the cot, and pressed his forehead against her uninjured shoulder. And he did not weep, though he was not far from it, and she put her good hand in his hair and held him there. They did not speak for a long while. Because some things, grief for a daughter 20 years dead, guilt for 40 years of misplaced trust, relief for a life nearly lost, and somehow, impossibly, saved, do not fit into words shaped small enough to say out loud right away. The wolf came back at moonrise. Across the western lawn, with Torin's 4 men trailing at a respectful distance, walking through the front gate as though it had been gone an afternoon and not what had felt, to everyone who loved it, like a lifetime. It came up the stairs, through the corridor into the small chamber, and laid its great silver head on Bryn's lap and made the book contented hum she had not heard since the ambush. And Bryn, who had spent the entire intervening hours not crying, finally cried then. Into its the deep, racking kind of crying she had not allowed herself in 2 years, not at the chapel, not at the theft accusation, not once until now, when there was finally, for the first time in longer than she could remember, someone and some safe enough to cry in front of. The wolf bore it patiently. The king held her hand. The court the following morning did not know quite what to do with itself. A chancellor of 40 years had died a traitor against the vault door he had once held the only key to. A servant girl chosen by the warden had taken a bolt meant for a sacred creature and lived. Rumor moved through the corridors the way rumor always moved, sideways and swollen, and by midday half the keep believed some version of the truth, and the other half believed something considerably stranger, involving curses and old grudges, and at least one account. Nadia relayed this one with visible effort not to laugh, that insisted the warden itself had struck Corvin down with lightning summoned from its own eyes. The physician who had treated Bryn's shoulder issued, at Ronan's request, a plain and unembellished account to the Cephald's desk. No lightning. No curse. A conspiracy 40 years is in the making, ended by the same weapon it had been built from. It was, he noted dryly, rather less exciting than the version involving lightning, but considerably more useful for anyone hoping to understand what had actually happened in their own home. Cook, for her part, said nothing to anyone about any of it. She simply began, that same week, keeping a slightly larger stock of willow bark and clean linen on a shelf near the kitchen door, in case anyone in this keep should ever again need tending in the middle of the night without wanting to explain why. But grief, however patient, does not pause the business of a kingdom for long. And 3 mornings after Corvin's death, a letter arrived that would open a second wound, one older, quieter, and in some ways harder to close than the first. Because a man who tries to have you killed and also happens to be someone's grieving father does not simplify the world. He complicates it. Bryn sat with that complication for a long while in the days that followed, one hand resting absently on the rosemary hedge, in the mornings when she should have still been asleep, her shoulder still healing. You're allowed to feel more than one thing about him, Ronan said, finding her there. I know that, she said. Knowing it doesn't make it simpler. No, he agreed. It rarely does. He killed to protect a wound, she said. I understand the wound, I don't understand the killing. Both of those things are true at the same time, and I don't know what to do with holding them both. You don't have to do anything with it, Ronan said. Some things you just carry. Until they get lighter on their own. Is that how it worked for you, the war? He was quiet a long moment. No, he admitted. For me it worked the opposite way. It got heavier for years. Then one night a maid fed a dying wolf, and it started, very slowly, getting lighter. A pause.
I don't fully understand why.
I've stopped needing to understand it.
I just know it's true.
It was into that unresolved quiet that the letter arrived. Addressed simply to B. Calder Castellan Keep, which meant whoever sent it either did not know or did not care what title she now carried. Nadia brought it to her in the library, held slightly away from her body, as though the paper itself might be dangerous. This came for you, she said. I don't know how it got past the gate clerks without questions. Bryn broke the seal. Read it once. Read it again, because the first reading did not seem possible. The letter was from Ren Vane, Dorian's sister. The quiet one who had always stood 3 steps behind her brother at every function and never once, as far as Bryn could remember, said an unkind word to her. Ren wrote that she had carried something for 2 years, that she should have carried to Bryn first, and that cowardice had kept her from it. That her brother had not acted alone in the matter of the brooch. That their father had structured the entire arrangement, not merely the debt, but the plan for what would happen once the match was made. That the rejection in the chapel had been decided before the ceremony ever occurred. That the theft had been planned too. That there existed in the family's private study a ledger recording the whole arrangement, dated in their father's own hand. Bryn set the letter down. For a long moment no one in the room spoke. There's a ledger, she said finally. Quiet, almost disbelieving. A written record, dated. Nadia's face had gone pale. Bryn, if that's real, that's not gossip anymore, that's evidence. I know that's the kind of evidence that ends a noble house, I know that too. She had assumed all this time that the whole Vane family had been equally complicit. She had been wrong about at least one of them. Which meant she might be wrong about other things too. She brought the letter to Tronan that evening. He read it twice. His jaw did the thing it did when he was containing something larger than his face wanted to show. This changes the shape of the theft investigation, he said considerably. It changes more than that. Bryn's voice was steady, but her hands, folded in her lap, were not. If there's a ledger, if the Vane family planned all of it, dated and in writing, that isn't a family being cruel to a servant. That's a documented conspiracy to defraud a physician's estate and frame his daughter for theft to cover the arrangement. Yes. Which means Dorian didn't act alone. Which means his father is the architect. Which means she stopped. Which means, Ronan said quietly, finishing the thought she didn't want to finish herself, that if this becomes public, it will not simply clear your name. It will destroy an entire noble house that has sat quietly at court for 2 generations. And noble houses do not fall gently. They fall on top of everyone standing near them when they go. Bryn was silent a long moment. I don't want anyone destroyed, she said finally. I want the truth. Those aren't always the same size. No, he agreed. They rarely are. They sent word to Ren Vane carefully, through a channel that would not draw attention. The response came within days, not a letter this time, but Ren herself, riding into the keep under a traveling cloak with no house colors visible, requesting a private audience with the woman my brother wronged, phrased exactly that way, no titles, no softening. Bryn met her in the same small library where Isolde had once sat across from her, studying her like an unfamiliar text. Ren Vane sat with her hands pressed flat together in her lap, the posture of someone bracing for a blow she believed she deserved. I brought it, she said without preamble, and produced from beneath her cloak a slim leather ledger, worn at the corners, clearly handled many times by someone deciding over and over whether to bring it forward. Bryn did not reach for it immediately. Why now, she asked. Why 2 years later? Ren's jaw tightened. Because 2 years ago I told myself it wasn't my place to interfere in my father's business. Because I told myself you would find a way to survive it. Because you always seemed like the kind of person who would. Because her voice cracked, small, sharp, because I was afraid of what my father would do to me if he found out I'd seen it. And I let that fear be bigger than what I owed you. And now? Now I heard the Silver Warden knelt at your feet in front of the entire court, Ren said. And I realized that if the goddess herself could see something in you worth choosing, then I had spent 2 years being smaller than a wolf. Bryn took the ledger, opened it, and found in a hand Ren confirmed was their father's. Dated entries spanning back nearly 3 years, the structuring of Bryn's father's debt, the deliberate escalation of its terms, and a note dated 1 week before the chapel ceremony that described, in plain and businesslike script, the intention to proceed with the rejection as arranged, followed within the month by the placement of the brooch, in order to ensure both her removal from noble quarters and her lasting public discrediting. Bryn read the entry 3 times, not to memorize the exact words. To let the fact of it settle where words could not quite reach. Planned, scheduled, written down like a household budget. She closed the ledger slowly. Her hand, She noticed distantly, were shaking now, though her voice, when it came, was very quiet and very level. They gave it a timeline, she said. They planned my humiliation on a calendar, yes, Ren said. There was nothing left to soften in the word. Bryn did not weep. She did not rage, though she had every right to both. She sat very still for a long moment, the ledger heavy in her lap, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried the particular calm of a person who has just watched 2 years of quiet self-doubt collapse under the weight of an undeniable fact. It was never about me, she said. Almost to herself, not the debt, not the rejection, not the theft. None of it was ever about who I was. It was a schedule. I spent 2 years thinking I had done something to deserve what happened to me, and the entire time it was already written down before it happened. Ren said nothing. There was nothing to say to that, and to her credit, she did not try. What do you want me to do with this? Bryn asked finally. I don't know, Ren admitted. I only know I couldn't carry it anymore. What you do with it is yours to decide. I've done the only right thing I know how to do, which was bring it to the person it belongs to. Bryn did not decide immediately what to do with the ledger. She carried it instead the way she had once carried bowls of stolen broth. Carefully, at odd hours, telling no one more than they needed to know. She told Ronan she did not yet tell the wider court. Because some truths she had learned needed a moment to breathe before they were handed to a room full of people who would immediately try to weaponize them. Isolde returned to the keep not long after, ostensibly for treaty follow-up, though by then neither Bryn nor Ronan pretended the visits were purely diplomatic anymore. They had, in the months since the selection, developed a habit of walking the upper gardens together in the mornings when Ice visited, a habit that had begun as simple courtesy and had grown gradually into something neither of them had quite named yet. Do you ever wonder? Ice asked, on one such morning, watching the warden lope ahead of them along the garden path, whether we'd have liked each other if none of this had happened? If the warden had simply knelt for me, the way everyone expected, and you'd simply gone on being a maid in this keep, and we'd never once had reason to speak? Bryn considered the question honestly, which was the only way she knew how to consider anything anymore. I don't think so, she said finally. Not because I dislike who you were then. I think we'd have never actually seen each other. You'd have been a princess I curtsied to in a corridor. I'd have been furniture you were trained not to notice. It would have taken something breaking to make either of us look properly. That's a bleak assessment of court life. It's an honest one. You said once that a discarded bride has more room to maneuver than a promised one. I think the same is true of friendship. Neither of us had any room to choose anything before. Now we do. Bryn watched the warden turn a slow circle in a patch of morning sun. I like that we get to choose this. I don't think I'd have traded the wolf kneeling for anything, even the version of this where nobody got hurt. Is that a terrible thing to— No, Isolde said quiet. I think it's simply the truth of what it cost to get here. Most good things cost something. The ones that pretend they didn't are usually the ones you can't trust. You look like a woman carrying something, Isolde said. One visit later, arriving unannounced in the breakfast room with the particular bluntness Bryn had come to treasure in her. Bryn told her everything. The letter, the ledger, Ren's confession. Isolde listened without interrupting, her expression sharpening with each new detail, until by the end she sat, fist still, hands the posture of a woman doing rapid political arithmetic behind an otherwise composed face. This is bigger than your name being cleared, Isolde said finally. I know, this is a documented conspiracy by a noble house to defraud an estate and frame an innocent woman to cover it. If that ledger becomes public in the wrong way, mishandled, leaked, twisted by the wrong faction, it will not simply destroy the Vane family. It could destabilize half the court's confidence in how matches and debts have been managed for a generation. You think I should bury it, I think, Isolde said carefully. You should be the one who decides how it comes to light. Not the court gossip network. Not some faction that finds it useful for their own purposes before you've had a chance to control the narrative around your own life. She paused. You have spent 2 years having your story told by other people, Bryn. Don't let this be one more time that happens. Bryn was quiet a long moment. What if it doesn't come from me at all, she said slowly. What if it comes from Ren publicly, before anyone else can frame the story for her? She confesses her family's conspiracy voluntarily, to the crown, before I ever present a formal grievance. That reframes everything. She isn't a co-conspirator caught by evidence, she's the person who came forward. Isolde's mouth curved, slow and genuine. That's very good. It's also true, Bryn said, which helps. It usually does, Isolde said. Court politics work best when the true and the strategy happen to line up. It doesn't happen often. When it does, you use it. Ren agreed without hesitation when the plan was put to her. I should have done it the honest way from the start, she said, sitting once more in the small library, hands no longer shaking the way they had the first time. I came to you quietly because I was afraid. This time I'd rather be afraid in public and have it mean something. The formal hearing was set for 8 days later, enough time, I advised, for word to spread through the court in careful, controlled fragments, so that by the time the truth was spoken aloud, it would land as confirmation rather than shock. Shock made people defensive. Confirmation made people ready to act. The night before, Bryn could not sleep. She sat in the small library long after Nadia had gone to bed. The ledger closed on the table in front of her, and found herself, for the first time in 2 years, afraid of a version of herself she had not yet had to be. Not the maid who fed a wolf in secret. Not the woman a king had chosen. Someone's knew a person who was about to stand at the edge of a hall and watch a family's entire history come apart in public, and who would have to hold her face steady while it happened, because 100 eyes would be looking for permission to feel whatever she showed them first. Ronan found her there near midnight. He did not ask if she was ready. He had learned by then that the questions insulted her more than it comforted her. I keep thinking about the day in the chapel, she said instead, without looking up. How quiet it was. Nobody shouted. Nobody argued. It was the quietest cruelty I have ever witnessed, and I have spent 2 years wondering if that's what made it so effective. Nothing to push back against. Just agreement. The whole room agreeing with him by staying silent. Tomorrow won't be quiet, Ronan said. No, she agreed. Tomorrow it gets to be loud instead. I find I don't mind that nearly as much as I thought I would. He sat beside her a long while, saying nothing further, because some nights the only useful thing a person can offer is simply not leaving the room. The hearing was not a trial. Ronan had been careful about that distinction from the start. A formal crown proceeding, conducted with the same measured gravity he brought to treaty negotiations and grain disputes alike. Bryn stood before the dais, no attendant, no house color, dressed plainly. I come before the crown, she said, her voice steady despite everything it cost her to keep it that way, to confess my family's role in a conspiracy against Bryn Calder and against the memory of her father. The hall went very still. She told it plainly. The debt, structured and restructured across years to become leverage rather than obligation. The chapel rejection, planned before the ceremony ever occurred. The brooch, placed deliberately to ensure both her reassignment and her public discrediting. She summarized the ledger's contents in her own words, careful and unflinching, because Bryn had asked her gently to speak the truth in her own voice rather than read her father's exact hand aloud a second time. It needed no embellishment to land like a blade. When she finished, the hall did not erupt the way courtroom scenes do in songs and stories. It went silent instead, the particular silence of 200 people, simultaneously reconsidering everything they thought they understood about a family they had dined with, danced with, done business with for 2 generations. Ronan spoke into that silence, his voice carrying the same controlled weight it carried in war councils. The Crown accepts this confession, he said, and recognizes the courage required to deliver it voluntarily against one's own family without external compulsion. He paused, letting that distinction land clearly before continuing. Bryn Vane will face no penalty for a conspiracy she did not architect and work to correct. The Vane estate, however, will answer in full for the debt manipulation, the false accusation of theft, and the public defamation of Bryn Calder's name and her father's memory. He looked then directly at Bryn standing at the edge of the dais, where she had insisted on standing, not seated among the nobility, not hidden among the servants, but exactly at the boundary between the 2 worlds she had spent her whole life straddling. Bryn Calder's name, he said, is hereby formally and permanently cleared. The theft record is struck from the archive. Her father's estate and the debt manipulation used against it will be reviewed by Crown auditors, with any improperly extracted funds returned to her as his sole heir. He let that settle a moment, then added, quieter, but no less clearly heard across the silent hall, and let it be recorded, for whatever value the court places on such records, that the goddess's own warden recognized what this court failed to recognize for 2 years, that a woman's worth is not decided by the debts of her father or the cruelty of the family who discard her, but by who she chooses to be when no one is watching. Bryn did not cry in front of the court. She had learned over 2 years exactly how much of herself to spend where, and she was not going to spend that particular currency on an audience, however sympathetic they had suddenly retroactively become. She cried later, in the garden, alone save for the wolf who lay beside her with its great silver head in her lap, while she finally let 2 years of careful, controlled grief simply exist without an audience to perform for or protect herself from. Dorian Vane had spent those 3 years the way a man spends years when he has decided, without ever quite admitting the decision to himself, that the fastest way to stop feeling guilty about something is to become extremely busy elsewhere. He had taken the commission with the Hollis house, because it was far enough from Castellan Keep that no one there had reason to mention Bryn Calder's name in his hearing, and close enough to his own family's holdings that he could still visit for the seasonal accountings without appearing to have fled anything at all. He had built, in that time, reputation as a capable, if unremarkable, administrator. He had courted briefly and without much conviction the daughter of a minor Hollis vassal, and had found himself more than once comparing her quite unfavorably, not in looks, not in temperament, but in some quieter, harder-to-name quality he eventually stopped trying to identify to a woman he told himself he barely remembered anymore. He had told the story of his rejected match when it came up at all in the same flat, practiced tone he had used in the chapel itself. An error the goddess made regrettable. Long settled. He had believed mostly his own telling of it. That is the particular danger of a story a man tells often enough. Eventually the story stops feeling like a lie and starts feeling like a memory. Dorian Vane learned of the hearing days after it concluded, 3 duchies away. In the private commission he had spent 3 years quietly building into something resembling a respectable life. The letter that reached him did not come from his family. It came from the Crown, and it contained, appended, a summary of his father's ledger entries, dated precise, as to the rejection and the brooch placement as a coordinated plan he, Dorian, had been fully informed of and had personally executed. He sat down slowly. Read it 3 times. There is a particular kind of silence that arrives when a man realizes the story he's told himself for 3 years was never actually true, that he was not merely following orders but an architect of them, that the shame he'd assigned so cleanly to Bryn Calder had been his own the entire time, simply relocated onto someone with less power to refuse carrying it. He did not travel to the keep to defend himself. He understood, reading that letter, that there was nothing left to defend. He wrote back instead. A single letter addressed not to the Crown, not to his family, but directly to Bryn, the first direct communication between them in 2 years. He did not ask forgiveness. He wrote only that what he had done to her in that chapel had never the goddess's error, but his own choice, dressed up afterward as fate so he would not have to carry the weight of having chosen it. He wrote that he understood the accounts between them remained, and would likely always remain, badly unbalanced. Bryn read the letter once, sat with it a long while, did not answer it. Because some letters do not require an answer to have done their work. Some letters simply need to exist, to have been written, to mark the moment a person finally stopped protecting the version of themselves that was easier to live with. She folded it, placed it in the same drawer as the ledger, not because she needed to keep either, but because she was no longer afraid of what they meant about her. They were both now simply history, not wounds. History. Before any of that, once the Crown auditors had finished their review and the improperly extracted funds from her father's estate had been formally returned to her as his sole heir, Bryn asked for one thing that had nothing to do with politics at all. She asked to go home, not to stay. Simply to stand, once, in the small border village where her father had practiced medicine for 20 years, and see the modest stone marker that had been placed over his grave by neighbors who could not afford anything grander and had insisted on marking it properly anyway, because a man who delivered half their children and set half their bones deserved at least a name carved into rock. Ronan rode with her, not as a king making a diplomatic visit he was careful to specify, but simply as a man accompanying someone he cared about to a place that mattered to her. He wore no circlet. The warden came too, padding easily alongside the horses the entire 2 days, drawing startled, delighted stares from village children, who had certainly never expected to see a creature out of their grandmother's stories walking calmly down their own muddy lane. The grave was smaller than Bryn remembered. 2 years does strange things to memory. It enlarges some things and shrinks others, and she had apparently, without meaning to, been carrying an image of her father's resting place that was grander than the modest stone actually was. She knelt beside it a long while, one hand flat against the cool granite, and told him quietly everything that had happened since the last time she'd stood there. The chapel, the kitchens, the wolf, the ledger. All of it, in the plain, unhurried sentences she might have used if he were simply sitting across the table from her again, correcting his own arithmetic under his breath the way he always had. "You'd have liked him," she said to Ronan afterward, as they walked back toward the horses, the warden trailing a respectful distance behind. He never once, in his whole life, treated a patient differently because of what they could pay him. I used to think that made him a poor businessman. I understand now it just made him a good man in a world that rarely rewards that particular quality. I'd have liked to meet him, Ronan said. For what it's worth, I think he raised the kind of daughter most fathers only hope for and rarely manage. She did not answer that. She simply took his hand and they walked the rest of the way in a silence that needed nothing added to it. The Vane's estate was formally reduced in the months that followed, not destroyed. Isolde's careful counsel having steered the crown toward proportion rather than annihilation, but stripped of the trade privileges and court standing that had let a family quietly weaponize a debt for 3 years without consequence. Ren, in an outcome no one, least of all Ren herself, had anticipated, was offered a position within the Crown's own auditing office, the very body now reviewing debt manipulation cases across the kingdom. It felt right, Ronan told Bryn when she asked why he'd made the offer. She spent 2 years afraid of what the truth would cost her family. Now she gets to spend her career making sure other families can't do what hers did without someone noticing sooner. Ren's first months in the auditing office were not easy ones. Several of the senior clerks, aware exactly whose daughter she was, made a point of double-checking her work long after it had become clear there was nothing in it to find fault with. She bore it with the same quiet steadiness she had shown standing before the dais at her own hearing. And slowly, methodically, the doubt around her thinned the way frost thins under a patient enough sun. By the time she uncovered the discrepancy in a minor trade family's debt records that saved a border miller from a manipulation nearly identical in shape to the one that had once nearly destroyed Bryn's own family, even her most skeptical colleagues had stopped waiting for her to fail. That's either very wise, Bryn said, or very poetic. I can't decide which. Why not both? Because you're a king, not a poet. I contain multitudes, he said, entirely straight-faced, and she laughed, actually laughed. The first full unguarded laugh he'd heard from her since the wolf had knelt at her feet, and something in his chest, that warm steady hum that had been quietly building for weeks now, settled another notch deeper. But there was still underneath all of it a wound the crown could not simply legislate closed, because Corvin's death had left a hole in the council no ledger could fill, and a kingdom does not run on love stories and cleared names alone. It runs on grain and treaties and the 1,000 unglamorous decisions a chancellor makes, so a king can afford to also be a person occasionally the seat needed filling. And Ronan, weeks after the hearing, called a council to discuss exactly that, a council in which Bryn, for the first time, was not merely permitted to sit but was formally seated as a voice with standing to speak. There are several candidates, Torrens said, laying out the customary list. Senior nobles, veteran administrators, the usual roster of names that had been circling ambitiously since word of Corvin's death first spread. Bryn looked at the list a long moment, then said quietly, "What about Ren Vane?" The room went still. The Vane name is currently synonymous with a conspiracy that took the crown years to unravel, Torrens said, not unkindly, simply stating the political reality. However admirable her confession, seating her as chancellor this soon would be not chancellor, Bryn said. Not yet, but she's sharp. She's brave, and so that cost her something real, which is rarer at this table than people pretend. Give her something smaller first. A junior seat in the auditing office overseeing debt reform specifically. Let her earn the rest the way everyone else at this table had to. Ronan looked at her, something like admiration settling into the corner of his mouth. You're proposing we build our next chancellor from the ashes of the last scandal. I'm proposing, Bryn said, that people should be judged by what they do after they know better. Not simply by the family they were born into or the mistakes made before they had the courage to correct them. It's a good instinct, said an older nobleman near the end of the table, Halloran, one of the more conservative voices in the room, who had said very little throughout the entire hearing weeks earlier. Whether it's a good policy remains to be seen. Then we'll see, Bryn said evenly. That's usually how policy works. You try the good instinct and adjust if it fails. You don't refuse to try it simply because failure is possible. Halloran studied her a long moment, then unexpectedly nodded. The warden chose well, he said, quiet enough that it wasn't quite meant for the whole table, though everyone heard it anyway. He sought her out privately some days later, in the corridor outside the council chamber, an unusual gesture from a man who had spent 30 years at that table without once, as far as anyone could recall, seeking out a junior voice for a private word. I owe you an explanation, he said without preamble, for my silence at the hearing. And before it. You don't owe me anything, my lord. I disagree, and I am old enough that you'll allow me the disagreement. He clasped his hands behind his back, the posture of a man arranging his thoughts before committing to them out loud. I sat on this council when the brooch was found in your coat 2 years ago. I said nothing. I told myself it was not my place to intervene in a household matter beneath my notice. The truth, which I have only recently found the stomach to admit to myself, is that intervening would have cost me something of friendship with the Vane household. A debt of my own I preferred not to disturb, and it was simpler to let a servant girl absorb a shame I could have questioned and did not. Why tell me now? Because watching a wolf choose you over 12 daughters of the oldest houses in this kingdom made it considerably more difficult to keep believing my silence back then had been neutral, he said. It was not neutral. It was a choice. I have decided rather late in my life that I would like to start making a different kind of choice from here forward. Whether that is worth anything to you is entirely yours to decide. Bryn studied him a long moment. It's worth something, she said finally. Not everything. But something that, Halloran said, with the faintest, driest suggestion of a smile, is precisely the honest answer I'd have expected from you. I find I've come to appreciate honesty rather more than I used to. The weeks that followed settled into something Bryn had never once, in 2 years of quiet, careful survival, allowed herself to imagine: a rhythm. A life with edges soft enough to lean into, rather than sharp enough to constantly guard against. She began slowly, doing the work no one had explicitly asked her to do, because it was the work that made sense to a woman who had spent 2 years learning exactly how a great house's quiet cruelties operated from the inside. She reviewed the servants' quarters personally, the first Luna in the keep's recorded history to do so, and found, unsurprisingly to her, shockingly to nearly everyone else, a dozen small entrenched injustices no noble had ever thought to examine. Wage docking for minor infractions that had calcified over generations into policy rather than punishment, as an inferior mess hall for Omega staff that existed by custom rather than law, a system for reporting theft or misconduct that, as she knew personally and painfully, offered us accused or servants meaningful process to defend themselves. She brought each finding to council, methodically, without drama, because drama, she had learned, made people defensive, and defensiveness closed doors that patient, plain evidence kept open. The Omega mess hall separation isn't law, she told the council the third time she raised a reform. It's custom. Nobody remembers why it started. It's simply calcified because no one with power ever had reason to question it. And you have reason, Halloran said, not unkindly, genuinely curious now in the way he'd become since the hearing. I ate in that mess hall for 2 years, Bryn said. I have every reason. The separation was formally ended within the month. Cook, who had, in her own quiet way, been the first person in the keep to see something in Bryn worth protecting, took personal visible pride in overseeing the merged kitchen staff, and made absolutely certain, in the weeks that followed, that no one under her supervision ever again went hungry for fear of being noticed asking. The first shared meal, on the evening the new arrangement took effect, was quieter than anyone expected. 2 years of separate tables do not dissolve into easy conversation simply because a wall of custom has been removed. Alphas and Omegas sat, that first night, in roughly the same clustered patterns they always had, only now shares a single long room instead of 2 divided ones, eyeing each other across a distance that had nothing to do with the actual space between the benches. It was Ottilie, of all people, the young laundry girl who had once quietly covered Bryn's chores, without ever asking where she disappeared to, who broke the pattern, sliding her plate down the bench to sit beside an alpha stable hand she'd never once exchanged more than a nod with, and asking him, plainly, whether the rumors about him being terrified of geese were actually true. He turned red. He admitted they were entirely true. The table nearest them laughed, and the laughter spread, the way laughter does in rooms that have been waiting a long time for permission to relax, and by the second week the seating had stopped sorting itself by old custom entirely and simply sorted itself, instead, by who happened to like whom. Bryn heard about the geese story from Nadia and laughed harder than she had in months. She made a private note, which she never acted on, because it felt like it would ruin the thing to formalize it, that some of the best reforms a person could make were not the ones written into law at all. They were simply the small human permissions that let people discover, on their own, that they'd never needed the wall to begin with. The theft accusation process took longer to reform, and mattered more, because it was the specific mechanism that had once been turned against Bryn herself. She worked on it with Wren, the two of them an unlikely pairing that neither had expected, and both had come quietly to value the woman who had been falsely accused and the woman whose family had orchestrated the accusation, building together a process that gave accused servants the right to formal review, witnesses, and appeal before any punishment or reassignment could be enacted. It won't stop cruelty, Wren said, the evening they finalized the draft. People will still find ways to hurt each other. Systems can't fix that entirely. No, Bryn agreed. But it can stop cruelty from hiding behind procedure. That's not everything, it's not nothing either. The first true test of the new process came that winter, when a stable hand named Cade was accused of pocketing coin from a merchant's delivery. 2 years earlier, the accusation alone would have ended him reassigned, or worse, with no chance to answer for himself. The way Bryn herself had once been turned inside out in front of witnesses and handed a verdict before she'd been permitted a single word in her own defense. Instead, under the reviewed process, Cade was granted a formal hearing before 3 impartial staff, a chance to say witnesses, and 7 days to gather what evidence he could. It took 4 of those days to discover that the missing coin had never been missing at all, a clerical error in the merchant's own ledger, a column added incorrectly, the kind of small human mistake that used to simply become someone else's ruin, because no one had ever built a process patient enough to look for it. Cade kept his position. He also, some months later, without any prompting from the crown, began quietly teaching 2 of the younger stable boys at their letters in the evenings, because he said when Wren asked him why, that a boy who could read his own contract was a boy who could never again be told a lie about what it said. Bryn heard about it secondhand, from Nadia, weeks after it happened, and said nothing about it to anyone at court. She simply sat with it a long while, the way she'd once sat with the marrow-bone cook left wrapped by the door, understanding that some victories were never meant to be loud. They were only meant to be real. Isolde returned periodically throughout these months, and their correspondence between visits had grown from formal notes into something closer to genuine friendship. It was during one visit that Isolde arrived with news that reshaped quietly the final political thread the story had left dangling. "My father is retiring," she said, over tea in the small library, with the particular bluntness that Bryn had come to treasure in her. "Formally, within the year." Which leaves the question of Vosrich's succession considerably more open than it has been in a generation. "And you intend to fill it?" "I intend to fill it," Isolde confirmed. "I've spent 5 years being trained as a bridge between 2 houses. It turns out I'm rather better suited to being the house itself." A pause, dry and precise. "The warden did me an enormous favor, in its own roaring, terrifying way. I would never have had the standing to make this argument to my father if I were still betrothed to a foreign king. A discarded bride, it turns out, has considerably more room to maneuver than a promised one." "You're going to be extraordinary at this," Bryn said. "I know," Isolde said, entirely without arrogance, simply stating a fact she had spent 5 years earning the right to state. "I intend to be a very different kind of ruler than my father was. Less parchment. More listening." A pause. "I learned that from watching you, if you want the truth of it. You listen to people the way most nobility only pretends to." The formal claiming ceremony delayed, deliberately, by both Ronan and Bryn's mutual insistence, through the entire aftermath of Corvin's betrayal, and the vain hearing finally arrived nearly a year after the night a wolf first knelt in a servant's corridor. It was small, private, by design. In a way, the original selection ceremony had been anything but the same kitchen garden. The same rosemary hedge, now permanently, if unofficially, treated by the keep's gardeners as something closer to sacred ground than ordinary shrubbery. Only the priestess, Torin, Wren, Nadia, and Isolde, who had ridden 3 days specifically for it, arriving the evening before with a single trunk and an expression of fierce, unhidden happiness that surprised everyone who remembered the cold composure she'd worn at the selection ceremony a year earlier. The warden lay at Bryn's hip throughout, its great silver head resting against her leg, older now by a year, that, on a creature of its kind, looked like nothing at all. The bite at her shoulder beside the old bolt scar, a second mark now, chosen this time rather than survived, was careful and quick, and she did not flinch. Because there is a particular kind of stillness that settles over a small gathering of people who genuinely love the two standing at its center, a stillness entirely unlike the vast performed hush of the selection ceremony a year before. No 200 witnesses calculating advantage. No candidates in white silk holding their breath for a verdict that was never meant to be theirs. Only a handful of people who had each, in their own way, helped carry this woman from a kitchen garden to this exact moment, standing quietly beneath a rosemary hedge that had somehow, without anyone officially declaring it so, become the truest chapel this kingdom had. Isolde wept, unashamed, which surprised precisely no one who had watched her over the past year learn slowly and deliberately to let herself feel things in front of people she trusted. Wren stood with her hands pressed to her mouth. Nadia had brought a handkerchief she did not, in the end, need for herself, and passed it instead to Torin, whose eyes had gone suspiciously bright in a manner he would later deny, with the particular stubbornness of a man who had spent a career being the most composed person in every room he entered. Afterward, Bryn rested her forehead against Ronan's, and they breathed together a long moment, and the bond that had been quietly present for nearly a year simply tightened by a final inch, like a knot finally drawn snug after a long, careful, deliberate pulling. In the 3 years since that morning in the garden, a great deal changed in the kingdom, and a great deal did not. Renvain became, in her 4th year at the auditing office, the youngest senior auditor the Crown had appointed in living memory, and the debt manipulation reforms she authored were by then being studied by 2 neighboring kingdoms who had heard, through channels neither official nor entirely unofficial, that Castellan had found a way to catch this particular kind of quiet cruelty before it calcified into custom. Isolde's coronation, delayed twice by matters of state neither more nor less complicated than the ordinary business of a transferring throne, was finally scheduled for the coming spring, and her letters to Bryn had, by then, grown longer and considerably less guarded than the careful diplomatic notes of their first year of correspondence. Cook had, at some point nobody could quite pin down, simply become the person new kitchen staff were sent to when they needed to understand not just how the keep's meals were prepared, but how its people were meant to be treated while preparing them, and Bryn herself had become, without ever quite setting out to become anything at all, the person servants across 3 neighboring holdings now quietly hoped might one day visit their own households and ask the same plain, patient questions she had once asked in her own kitchen. Not because she demanded change. Because she simply noticed what had always been there and refused to look away from it once she had. 3 years after that morning in the garden looks almost exactly the same. The frost has not come yet. The rosemary is silvering faintly with morning dew. The warden is older now, though on a creature that has outlived 400 years of Castellan kings. 3 years registers as barely a season. It lies full length beneath the hedge, its great pale flank rising again. And beside it, sitting with the absorbed, serious concentration of a child performing genuinely important work, is a small boy of 2.5. Dark slate eyes, the Castellan signature passed down clean and unmistakable. His mother's quiet, watchful mouth. His name is Wyatt. He was named for no one in particular, because Bryn and Ronan had agreed, early and without much debate, that he would be permitted to be himself first and a symbol of anything second, if at all. Bryn sits on the bench near the hedge, in a plain grey dress, hair braided in the simple border village style she has never once abandoned. Not even as Luna, not even as the woman who quietly, patiently, over 3 years, reformed half the unspoken cruelties of an entire royal household. Her shoulder, where the bolt went in nearly 4 years ago now, twinges faintly in cold weather. This morning the twinge is faint enough to ignore. Ronan comes down the garden path with 2 cups of something hot in his hands, no ceremonial coat, shirtsleeves pushed up, the way she has always liked him best, the way he has slowly, deliberately, allowed himself to simply be a man in a garden rather than only ever a king in a hall. He sits beside her without speaking, hands her one of the cups. She leans into him without speaking either, and the warden lifts its head briefly to acknowledge them both, then settles again, because Wyatt is patting its flank with great seriousness, and the warden, evidently, considers this the more pressing matter. He's going to fall asleep on it, Bryn says. The wolf or the boy? Yes. He laughs low against her hair. They watch their son a while. Wyatt hums to the warden. He doesn't yet have words for most things, but he has a hum, small and steady and utterly contented, and the warden beneath his small patting hand hums back. The 2 sounds fit together in the morning air the way 2 threads finally fit when a weaver has, at last, gotten the tension exactly right. Wren's finished the auditing review for the eastern villages, Ronan says after a while. Clean debt records across every household this time. First full season with no irregularities. Good, Bryn says. That. Tell her I said so. I told her yesterday. She wanted to hear it from you specifically. Then I'll tell her myself this afternoon. Isol writes that her coronation date is finally set. I know. She told me last week. Then why am I telling you? Isolde had written in that same letter a small addendum she had asked Bryn not to mention to Ronan directly, though Bryn suspected, from the wry note in the postscript, that Isolde fully expected it to reach him eventually anyway. She had written that she intended on the day of her coronation to stand before her own gathered court and speak plainly about the year that had unmade, and then remade her future, the selection, the roar, the wolf that had handed her a freedom she had never once been permitted to ask for herself. She had written that she wanted her own people to understand, from her own mouth, that being set aside was not the tragedy the old stories made it out to be. Sometimes, she intended to tell them, it was simply the moment a life finally became your own to shape. Because it's pleasant, Bryn says, to hear it twice. He laughs again and she turns her face into his shoulder. And the warden, beneath Wyatt's small hand, makes its low, contented hum, and Wyatt, without waking, without any awareness at all of the years of grief and cruelty and careful, hard-won correction that led to this exact quiet morning, smiles in his sleep like a boy who has just heard a private joke only he was let in on. Torrin passes along the garden path a while later, older now himself, gray threading through his temples in a way that had crept up on him gradually enough that no one at court quite remembered him without it. He pauses at the sight of the small family beneath the hedge, and permits himself briefly the rare indulgence of a genuine smile, the kind he had spent a career training himself not to show in front of the men he commanded, on the theory that a captain's face should give nothing away. He gives it away now anyway, because there is no one here who requires him to be anything other than a man glad to see the people he has spent years quietly protecting finally living a life worth protecting. Captain Bryn says without opening her eyes. "My lady," he says, and continues on because some mornings do not require conversation to be complete. They only require witnesses. Bryn reaches down after a while and unhooks a small silver charm shaped like a cup from the chain around her neck, a gift from that first careful spring, meaning only that he had once thought of a bowl of broth she never got to finish, and sets it gently into the basket of rosemary cuttings resting beside the bench, because she realizes, setting it down, that she has not taken it off since the day he gave it to her. And the mornings is warm enough, finally, to give it a rest. Because there is nothing left in this garden that she needs it to remind her of. Someday, she knows, Wyatt will ask about the small silver cup resting in the rosemary basket, or about the faint sauce her collarbone, or about why the great silver creature napping beside him in every summer of his childhood is spoken of, by the older staff, in a tone usually reserved for legends rather than pets. She does not know yet exactly what she will tell him, or when or how much of it a small boy's heart is ready to carry. She knows only that she will tell him honestly, the way her own father once told her the truth about hard things in a voice that never once talked down to her for being young. She will tell him about a girl who fed a dying animal because it was bleeding and she could not walk past that. She will tell him that the rest of it, the crown, the ceremony, the kingdom, came after, and came because of that one small unremarkable decision and not the other way around. She thinks that is probably the only lesson in this whole strange, difficult, extraordinary story worth handing down to a child. Not the wolf, not the throne, just the bowl and the choice to fill it, on a night when no one at all was watching. The warden sneezes a great, soft, undignified silver sneeze, and Wyatt, without waking, smiles wider, as though the joke had simply gotten better. Some endings are quiet like that. Not because the story was small. 'Cause it's us, after everything it cost to get here, it no longer needs to be loud to be true.